I'm not as busy as I should be.
Yeah.
that should be completely full.
Yeah, I think that's probably true for a lot of us. We're not as busy as we should be, but we are live fellers. So I think we should do the standard YouTube thing where you guys kind of introduce who you are and what you've got going on, as is tradition. I guess we could start. Let's start with Matt.
Yeah, if we go clockwise round, yeah.
Sure thing. Hi, I'm Matt. I have my YouTube channel, Physically Debunked, where I talk about various arguments for God's existence, various interesting things in physics and science as well. I'm currently a PhD student in cosmology, and I study the early universe.
I'm Nathan. My YouTube channel is called Digital Gnosis, where sometimes I interview philosophers and do critiques of apologetics, and sometimes I just sort of hang out with people and talk about stuff. I'm currently a master's student in philosophy, just finishing up my dissertation.
Oh, see, and that's the thing I was going to ask you, Nathan, is I thought that you were doing something in philosophy, but I wasn't sure if you'd dropped out of that or if you would switch. So I'm glad you would mention that.
I've got 2 more weeks to finish my dissertation, and then I'm doing a PhD in psychology and computer science, so I can actually do something tangible.
Oh, so you are planning to go into a PhD program? Right on.
Yeah, that's right.
I wish I could, but education in the United States, or I should say access to it, is not, I guess you could say, up to certain European standards. But that aside, I run the channel, so I don't think I really need to introduce myself. By the way, for everybody watching, I'm probably not going to link Nathan and Matt in the chat, because if you look at the title of the stream, they're both tagged there. If you just click on those links, they'll take you right to the channel. So today, we're going to be discussing teleological arguments, fine-tuning arguments for God's existence. I was wanting to focus more on sort of the cosmological ones, but if you guys are willing to talk some, maybe the biological ones, maybe we can get there. But starting with you, Nathan, what do you think the strongest formulation of a fine-tuning argument is, and then what do you think the weakest formulation would be?
So maybe it's first useful just to kind of talk about this classification of teleological arguments, right? Because when it comes to people will broadly talk about classes of kind of arguments from natural theology. So those might be arguments that purport to establish the existence of a god, or the non-existence of a god. You might call those arguments from atheology, right? And then there are various kind of classifications basically that people put arguments into. So teleological arguments. Teleology is supposed to do with real ends, right? So the idea being in Aquinas's fifth way, I think it is, that there are certain things that have real ends, and the only sort of way for them to have those real ends is for them to kind of be designed by a god, or to have been given those ends by a creator. But I mean, there's different types of then design arguments that get called teleological, and fine-tuning arguments, which I would say are slightly different, that get called teleological as well. I don't think it's inappropriate to call them teleological, but it's just useful to say that that's kind of a classification that's given to the arguments. And then, of course, within each of those kind of sub-categories, there's various different kind of formulations of these arguments. So fine-tuning arguments are arguments which appeal to a particular feature of our universe. So namely, the values of various free parameters, I think the physicists call them. I mean, I'll leave a lot of the physics to Matt, I think, because from my point of view, I'm more interested in the kind of what I take to be philosophically kind of contentious claims that are built into the fine-tuning argument, right? And I think I'm happy for the physicists to just say whatever they want, and I'll keep philosophy aside from that. And so the idea is that these free parameters take certain values, right? And those values are values which permit the existence of life in our universe. I mean, given that we're here asking these questions, right, we can agree that life exists, or observers of some form exist. But then there's this sort of question, right, of, well, could those values have been otherwise? And if they could, why do the values in our universe take the values that they do rather than some other values? And then sort of exploring that question, the idea is that there's this kind of big, you might call it like a possibility space, right? Where most of the universes, in fact, are not life permitting, but ours is. And so the claim is that our universe is then finely tuned for life, because it has this property that's very unique or special, that it's life permitting, that most other universes don't share. that fine-tuning, it is claimed, cries out for an explanation, right? It's sort of strange. So then there are various kind of hypotheses that get proposed. When it comes to natural theology, fine-tuning advocates are sort of making the claim that either the best explanation, I mean, I think it's best put in a kind of Bayesian form, right? Which is to say, we can kind of calculate the posterior odds, and I can, if it would be useful, go into details of what all this means. We can calculate like the posterior odds of various hypotheses given, given this piece of evidence, the universe is being fine-tuned, and just compare those, how those hypotheses fare to one another. And the idea is that theism sort of comes out on top when we do that comparison compared to not theism. You can talk about whether just comparing it to not theism is fair, which I'm sure we will at some point. How it fares when compared to specific atheistic hypotheses or maybe different models of God and so forth. That you can do all of that, but I think that that's something like the strongest version of a fine-tuning argument, right? Is to put it in that form, and then the weakest version of a fine-tuning argument is probably going to be something like what William Lane Craig argues for, where he puts it in a kind of deductive form, right? So he says, well, the fine-tuning of the universe can either be explained by chance, necessity, or design. It can't be explained by chance, and then I'll say, and it can't be explained by necessity, so it must be explained by design. And I think that it's just not true, right, that those are the only possible ways of explaining it. So that would be the premise, that disjunctive premise would be, or trijunctive, I don't even know what the right word is, but that would be the premise I'd object to. Yeah.
Sorry about that delay. I'm trying to use hotkeys, and if I click on certain things, they do hotkeys for a computer instead of hotkeys for StreamYard. But Matt, let's move over to you. What do you think of fine-tuning arguments? How would you characterize them? And then what do you think the strongest and the weakest formulations of them would be?
Oh, well, I think the fine-tuning, in a sense, doesn't actually need to be something that's connected to theism or these kind of arguments at all. So fine-tuning in the way that especially I'm interested in is something we've noticed or realized about physical properties of the universe that we live in and certain peculiar aspects, as Nathan said, of the kind of 7 or so constants, these numbers which are not predicted by the current physical theories that we have, but just have to be put in and set to the value that they are from our observations. So what fine-tuning is, and I think what is a nice way of saying what it is, which is kind of independent of all the further arguments that people want to make about it, fine-tuning is simply that out of all the kind of possible values for these parameters which we could select, it seems that a very small percentage of these are life-permitting in the space of these possible values. And when we say possible, that's something that we can get into in a lot more detail later. But for now, let's say for all we know, these are possible. In the space of these possible values, most of them will not permit the evolution of life in a universe that had those values for the constants. And that's something that's interesting in and of itself. This is something that's coming just from our understanding of physics, just from our understanding of cosmology and how the universe develops and what these constants do, how they affect the universe if we change them. That's just coming from this. And this is also not to say anything loaded, which is often the kind of fine-tuning claim that lots of people seem to jump to. Lots of people seem to jump to that fine-tuning is the claim that the particular values of the constants that our universe have are unlikely in some sense. That's a very separate claim from just saying that in the space of possibilities, very few of the points in that parameter space are life-permitting. So what I think is just the basic way, the most useful way of defining what we mean by fine-tuning, the most kind of independent of all the arguments that people then want to make about it, is just to say that out of all the possibilities that we can see for the values of these parameters, a very small subset, a very small percentage of them appear to permit the evolution of life.
Right on. So it seems that what I'm gathering from both of you is that number one, sort of a Bayesian style teleological argument, maybe something along the lines of, I think, Robin Collins, Luke Barnes, it seems to be the strongest formulation in that. Really what we're looking at is that there's a probability space and that of values that the constants can hold, and the set of those values that are going to permit life, at least as we see it, are just going to be very, very small, and we need some sort of explanation for that. Do you guys think that that's pretty fair characterization?
I think it is. It might be worth mentioning as well that I mean, even when discussing which form of argument to use or what a particular form of one of these arguments shows, I mean, there are kind of contentious points within that, right? About like, for example, if we're Bayesians in some sense, well, what sort of probability, how should we interpret, these kind of assessments of probability or the relationship between evidence and hypotheses and what they show? And I tend to take quite a permissive view on this, where I'm kind of like, I'm not too committed to any particular interpretation, and I'm sort of willing to say, well, even regardless of which interpretation we're going to take, the reason that the Bayesian kind of formulation is good is because it just provides a helpful heuristic to figure out what's going on.
When you say interpretation, you're talking about like statistical interpretation, like Bayesianism, frequentism, stuff like that?
Yeah, so there are so in terms of what probabilities even mean, there's like different, there's like subjectivist or objective, there's all these terms that get thrown around, or logical interpretations of probability, which is to say that propositions have some kind of probabilities, or credence based, which is then to make them more subjective. There's all these issues that can come up, and I think that a lot of those issues, though maybe interesting, in their own right, are not particularly relevant to the fine-tuning question and don't have a lot of bearing on what's going on. And I think it's just useful to look at framing the argument in this Bayesian form as sort of providing this useful heuristic for pointing out what relevant considerations actually do to the argument. So you've got the probability of some hypothesis. So theism is going to be a hypothesis. That would be the hypothesis that maybe a limitless physical independent, that's not quite the right phrasing, but a limitless kind of mind exists, right, of some sort, just to give a kind of bare theism, right? And then you have not theism, which might be actually, and as I say, I think this is something to talk about, a kind of weighted average of a bunch of different hypotheses, right, put together, or maybe some specific atheism, and you can kind of compare how those look conditional upon fine-tuning. So that's to say, given that we're in the probability space of, we know fine-tuning is the case, right? What proportion of worlds or something like that? I mean, it's kind of difficult not to use loaded language to describe this. Theistic ones, or what proportion of those worlds are like atheistic ones? That's approximately the question. And if more of those worlds are theistic ones, then that means that fine-tuning is in fact evidence in favor of theism. It biases it in favor of that point of view. And then the formula, I think, for calculating that odds form, is basically, you have the ratio of the prior probabilities of each of those hypotheses to each other. And again, how people think about the priors here could be different, because people might mean priors in some pure sense, right? Like, absent any evidence whatsoever. Or people might mean priors given all of our background knowledge that we currently have when they come to evaluate this argument. And that might be an important distinction. And then you multiply that by the ratio of the likelihoods. So that is to say how strongly each of these hypotheses predicts the evidence of fine-tuning, right? So given that we're in all the possible worlds that are theism, in how many of them does God finely tune in the relevant sense, a universe that he creates or something? Or given that we know we're in the atheistic possible worlds, what proportion of those are finely tuned? And then usually the idea, I mean, again, each of what values you should assign to these things is going to be contentious, right? And those are points to be debated. But the idea is going to be that the kind of likelihood of fine-tuning given theism is just so high compared to sort of all other competing hypotheses that sort of overcomes, even if you've got sort of iffy priors that might even be against theism in the first place, because you're just multiplying across those odds, and that's going to give you it's going to make the hypothesis given that piece of evidence like very high or top heavy when it's in that odds form of the fraction, right?
Anything you'd like to add onto that, Matt?
I think that covers this kind of Bayesian approach very well. It's the most. I agree with Nathan that it's the most useful in addressing fine-tuning arguments, specifically when we're actually getting into the arguments and what hypotheses might are supported and which explain the evidence better. It just gives a very nice framework where we can calculate priors, we can calculate likelihoods, we can discuss what affects these things, and discussing these things then leads to a conclusion on which hypothesis is favoured over the other. It's a nice framework to be talking on the same terms.
I will say that the people that I have seen that seem to take the argument seriously on either side certainly seem to take this framework when examining the argument. So I do think that I definitely agree with you guys there. There was something that you said, Nathan, that caught my attention, and this is a question that's lingered in the back of my mind. You said that, we've got these fine-tuned parameters, they sort of cry out for an explanation. Do you guys think that the teleological argument is a variation of a contingency argument, or do you think it's separate enough that it could be pulled out of that category?
I think it's separate when it's given in this form, because when it's given in this form, you're talking about, how much this piece of evidence favors a particular hypothesis, right, after the fact. So then if this piece of evidence is true, and I think it is, then, well, it depends. It is in some sense, right? Because I actually sort of have some questions about fine tuning for physical life versus fine tuning for life, which is sort of muddy the waters for me. But I mean, supposing that this piece of evidence is true, right? It might be the case, and that you have this really high likelihood, given theism, then it is probably going to favor the theistic hypothesis. And I think each of those bits of the equation is, you can kind of question them, or you could compare them to a different a specific atheistic hypothesis, right? Where, in terms of what you're saying about contingency arguments, the approach is going to be similar in terms of saying, there isn't some sort of further explanation, that kind of conjunction of all contingent facts or something just is the case, or it's just necessary. So like you can compare it to a hypothesis that's going to respond to the contingency argument in a similar way, but I do think it's a different argument. If that,
I think maybe what's a key difference between the two is just that the fine-tuning argument is something that's very evidence motivated. The fine-tuning argument comes from observations in physics, in science, whereas a contingency argument, while it's kind of maybe very vaguely connected when you're talking about contingencies and causation and these kinds of things to science, it's a much more philosophical argument.
So, with respect to the term fine-tuning, this is one that it raises a lot of questions in my head. As I understand it, when a physicist says something like, fine-tuning, like a fine-tuning problem, they're referring to, there's really two ways I've heard it. The first one is either that we have to put in certain values for parameters to get the model to work. It's sort of like we have to fine-tune the model. But I've also heard that it's that there are reasons why these parameters take these values, perhaps, but we don't know what those reasons are yet. So you could say that they're fine-tuned. The question I'd like to ask you guys, and I suppose we could start with Matt on this one. Do the, I don't know if I'd use the word apologist specifically, but do those pushing a fine-tuning argument, do they mean fine-tuning the way that physicists mean it, or do they mean something different?
I think there's very often you can get different people saying fine-tuning and meaning very different things. So when we say fine-tuning in the case of when physicists say that we're discussing fine-tuning, all they mean is that there are these constants which aren't determined by the physical laws. We have to put them in by hand. Well, that's not necessarily the fine-tuning, but we have to put whatever theory we have until we have a kind of final theory of everything. You're always going to be putting in numbers, values for constants which aren't predicted by the theory itself. Only if all three parameters were predicted by by the theory itself, you'd have a final theory of physics. You'd have an ultimate theory, and there potentially wouldn't be any more questions after that. So in physics, you'll always have whatever theory you're working with. You'll have constants, and these aren't predicted by the theory itself. They're given by observation and experiment. But we can ask the hypothetical question, which we can do in theoretical physics. What would happen if we change the values of these parameters? Because they're not predicted by the theory itself, we have this freedom theoretically to explore what happens when we change them. And so when physicists say fine-tuning, in this sense, what they mean is that when we do this exercise of changing the values of these parameters, it turns out that even changing them just a tiny percentage in their what's considered to be their natural range of values that they could potentially take, when we vary them just a tiny bit, the whole kind of composition, evolution, history of the universe, everything changes very dramatically, and in such a way that completely destroys any possibility of life emerging in these hypothetical toy universes. So that's what physicists mean. I think that's all that physicists really mean when they use the term fine-tuning. It's just that this tiny little variation has catastrophic effects in these hypothetical universes for life. Now, when I think a lot of the time when theists and apologists are using the term fine-tuning, they're using it in a different sense, in a much more loaded sense. We're saying that it's very unlikely that the universe should have the values of the constants that it does, and hence it's very unlikely that that life should exist on naturalism, on a not theism hypothesis. There's a step between those two claims, which is not trivial.
Yeah, I would maybe distinguish between how apologists frame fine-tuning, maybe, or some apologists at least, how maybe philosophers talk about it and how physicists talk about it. I mean, how physicists talk about it, I'm willing to just go with whatever Matt says, because like I say, I don't really engage with that much of like physicists talking about fine-tuning, whatever. How apologists tend to talk about it. And look, there are some Christians who are fairly careful about this. I mean, Luke Barnes would be one, right? Where built into this metaphor of fine-tuning is, this idea of a hand setting a dial, right? And you could say, well, that's relatively unfortunate and it's prone to lead us astray. But I do think a lot of apologists pry on that fact, right? That built into the metaphor is this maybe misleading kind of picture of a hand setting various dials, and that just leads, I think, people who are thinking uncautiously about these things to think that that's what fine-tuning just is this fact about the world, that the sort of various values have been set by like a hand on a dial or something. Now that's like probably the least cautious way of talking about it or something. I think how I come across it being talked about in a lot of the philosophical literature, to say that some world is fine-tuned for some property is to say that of the kind of set of all the ways the world could have been, there's a very small proportion of them that have this particular property, right? And now, as Matt said, I'm not sure how much that actually kind of aligns with what physicists mean, but I do think that is that's kind of required to motivate postulating some explanation in the philosophical sense, because then the question is, well, what explains why it's this way rather than that way?
I think that chimes very well with what physicists say as well. It's just what we want to distinguish between is the claim that it's just a small subset of the possibilities, and the claim that it's very unlikely or requires intervention. I think is the key difference. But a term that I've come across various people using, and I've toyed with the idea of using it sometimes, is to distinguish between apparent fine-tuning and fine-tuning. I think I
use alleged because it's more loaded.
I think it's fair enough in physics to say something along the lines of that the universe appears fine-tuned. The values of the constants, if we change them even a bit, everything changes, and so it appears like the universe is fine-tuned. Whereas we could then distinguish this from actual fine-tuning, which would be to say that actually this kind of this knob turning kind of thing needed to happen. So I don't know if that's how standard that is, but that's a nice kind of distinction that I think people being careful when they're talking about fine-tuning are talking about apparent fine-tuning in that sense, and people who are being slightly careless are using the fine-tuning in the other sense.
So would that distinction relate to, I feel like I've heard that distinction, and I've heard it as the difference between teleology and teleonomy. Have you guys heard anything like that before?
I've not
ring
heard
a bell
of
for
teleonomy.
me.
Yeah, no. I would take teleology generally to be the idea that there are like real ends built into things, something like that. So like directedness towards some goal. But I'm not really familiar with teleonomy. So.
I guess the idea, the connection between fine-tuning and teleology, I guess, is that if you do have this hand turning, it's this nature was goal directed towards the future evolution of life. So that, I guess, that's the connection between teleology and fine-tuning. I don't know what teleonomy is.
Okay, because what I hear is that teleology is like what Nathan said, that there is this like there is an end built into the system or what have you, and then teleonomy is that, well, it kind of looks like there is, but it's not really an end. It just looks like there might be an end to it. Like a lot of people will say in life, it looks like there's some sort of end in what some living creature is supposed to do, but there really isn't. So I just didn't know if that was a distinction you guys have heard.
Well be.
It sounds like a sensible distinction, and it sounds like the kind of thing which I think I'm talking about.
Okay. And this sort of leads into another question. Maybe we've already answered it, but I'd still like to ask it anyway. Does it really make sense to say that our universe is fine-tuned? And to add on to that, does it make sense to say that our universe is fine-tuned for some property? And if so, what sense does it make to use that language? I guess I don't really know. Nathan, let's just throw it to you.
So I think in the sense sort of that we've kind of defined it right to say that the universe has some property that for all we know in the space of all ways the universes could have been, that's to say like in epistemic possibility space, it probably wouldn't have had that property. So it's a very small proportion. So if that's what fine-tuned means, then it does make sense, at least. Like I can understand what someone's saying if they say the universe is fine-tuned for some property. But there is, a remaining question as to whether or not that is actually true. When it comes to untangling what the claim that the universe is fine-tuned for life is actually saying, I have a very hard time sort of untangling the claim myself, because usually proponents of fine-tuning, and I mean, theists here who are kind of relying on the physics and stuff, that they will depend upon, I think, a kind of understanding of life where what it is to be life is grounded in some kind of physical states or something, right? So I'm not sure whether grounding or supervenience as a type of grounding relation is the best way to articulate this, and this is what I'm trying to think about. But it's something like, for there to be life, right? This is the thinking of most physicists. Well, there has to be certain kind of chemistry taking place or something like that. So I mean, if you have carbon, maybe it's pretty easy because of the valency of carbon. It means you can
sufficient level of complexity, something like that, yeah. Perhaps.
But it's importantly, it's physical complexity, right? Which is grounded in certain physical states obtaining in those worlds. And now, so okay, it's difficult to define life in that biological or physical sense. And I think that's all right. I mean, I think people like Luke Barnes do get around this. So what Luke Barnes says is, well, okay, I can't tell you what life is. Like, I can't say, well, it is maintaining homeostasis, or it is having a metabolism or whatever. The way that Luke Barnes goes about it is he says, well, I can quite clearly identify what it's not, right? So imagine a world like this where, I don't know, like stuff just pops into existence and it all, just blasts apart in a split second, and then that's it. What he's like, well, I can say with a high degree of confidence that there's no life there, and no physical life there, right? I think is important. Yeah. And I do agree with him in that case. And his claim then is, well, look, the vast majority of the worlds are more like that, and so that which is just the same as making the claim that the minority of the worlds, a physical life permitting in this other sense. However, I think that this idea of physical life, right, is a bit of a sticky wicket to untangle what's going on there. And I'm still working through why exactly I have this problem myself. So, I mean, maybe to begin with, that there's an intuition, right? An intuitive case. And I don't want this to be a red herring and distract if Matt's got like a good answer for fine tuning for life, if you want to say at this point. But
no, go ahead. I agree. I basically agree with what you've said so far.
So my intuition is going to be something like, suppose we found out with certainty that there was a civilization of disembodied angels, right? Who, they fall in love with one another. They have families. They have societies and politics and all this stuff. Well, surely we'd say we discovered, a form of life. And what I'm really getting at there is this idea that there are sort of different psychophysical laws, different kind of metaphysical possibilities, maybe you might say, right? And once we take those into account, then it's possible to have universes that contain life, but in, with those states of affairs where the physics is in fact very different. So when we're saying it's physically life unfriendly, like one of these universes that just blasts apart, there might actually be, there's a possibility that there could be psychophysical laws in that universe that we could describe, where, I don't know, a muon or whatever experiences love, or there's a soul that is somehow connected to that muon and, goes through all this soul building process in that split second of, you just need to get the psychophysical laws sufficiently friendly in that case. And if we can call those cases life, then for me, that changes the landscape of the entire possibility space, such that when we're making the claim that that universes that are fine-tuned for life, that is to say, have this property of being life-permitting, is very small, I'm not sure that that's right anymore. And now there's a series of responses that fine-tuning advocates can make to this. But I mean, this how it gets responded to is going to have further implications for how persuasive the argument is to people who aren't already convinced of the conclusion. The kind of likelihood of God, like producing a world like this as opposed to some other world, if God's got like these various different opportunities, or the prior probability of theism, if you're gonna kind of bake in very specific desires into, if you're like, theism is the hypothesis that some unlimited being exists and that being has desires to create a universe where minds supervene on carbon-based brains or something like that, well, then that's going to have a much lower prior probability than the prior probability of like just bare theism or whatever. So I mean, that's how I think about it, and I think it is really contentious what exactly is being claimed when it's claimed that the universe is fine-tuned for life. I think in this in the sense physicists might mean it, right, where the universe of discourse is limited in this way. It might, I think that's a kind of different thing to this universe of discourse that includes potential explanations like gods and things like that. And so that's where my thinking goes on this. But I don't know.
Yeah. So in the kind of things that physicists talk about, the kind of domain about which we're talking in possibility space is really very small, and it's kept small because that's the kind of possibility space that we can sensibly talk about in physics. You can talk about all these other possibilities, these epistemic possibilities where you have psychophysical laws or all sorts of strange, very kind of supernatural kind of ideas and systems which may be present. But in physics, we're very deliberate in keeping that domain of discourse down and keeping it down to something much smaller, something that we can sensibly talk about. We restrict everything down. We don't even allow these constants to vary over all the real numbers, let's say. We only allow these constants really to vary over a range which we deem natural based on considerations in physics already. So yeah, we're considering a very kind of small subset of all the possibilities that you could possibly think of. It's just the one subset that makes sense to talk about. Now, fine tuning is only really actually kind of quite striking when you're dealing with it in a physicist sense. If you're assuming the kind of criteria which physicists have for life developing, which is usually just some kind of complexity, when we're striking out universes as being life prohibiting, we're generally quite generous in that we will only strike out universes if literally no atoms ever interact, nothing or everything collapses down in a fraction of a second before anything really happens. But because so much of the possibility space, because in so much of the possibility space, that's what's happening. You get these ridiculous universes where no interesting interactions whatsoever are happening. Only in this sense is then does our universe appear fine-tuned for life. If you're only assuming the kind of physical laws that we have, this kind of naturalism based on science that we currently know, then you have this kind of this apparent fine-tuning where most possibilities are life prohibiting. If you start permitting some, if you go beyond naturalism, and say that naturalism isn't everything, and you start introducing these psychophysical or these various supernatural or strange other laws, well, actually that as Nathan said, that completely changes everything, and it's not entirely clear what effect that will have, other than that it may mean that our universe isn't so fine-tuned. It may be that there are lots of other possibilities out there, and so the parameter space that is actually life-emitting is much larger than we're led to believe based on the physics, the fine-tuning physics that we know.
So I think one point to just say about building on what Matt said there, right, is that I think when the universe of discourse is restricted in this naturalist sense, right, asking the question about fine-tuning, I think it might be built in such a way, and I'm figuring out it's difficult for me to articulate what I mean by this, but I think that the universe of discourse in the first place is set up in such a way that it excludes certain hypotheses like disembodied minds, like God existing, for example, right? And so I think that's going to be a problem if you have if you're saying like, well, what's the probability of fine-tuning given theism if theism is a hypothesis that's ruled out by fine-tuning as you mean it? And that's that's kind of one issue for me.
A couple of questions, just really quickly, Nathan. Does this relate to because my understanding of like deep statistics and probability is not as well developed as your guys is. Does this, what you just mentioned, does that relate to something that a term I should say I've heard you use, conditionalization?
Kind of. I mean, I guess this is going to depend on your interpretations of what's going on, right? When we think about probability, but so I mean, strictly to say, what's the probability of A conditional on B? I think, at least for me, maybe this isn't for everyone, the easiest way to think about this is geometrically, right? So we're saying that given that we're in this B space, which I'm kind of representing as this circle here, right? What proportion of that are A states of affairs? So like, if it's a small amount, then the ratio of that amount to the total amount is going to be, is going to be small. The probability of A conditional on B is going to be small. If it's a big amount, then the ratio is going to be quite big. It's so the probability of A given B. Now, in terms of what's going on when we talk about the universe of discourse, I suppose that is a kind of conditionalization, right, on what we can imagine as something. We're sort of saying, well, look, I'm restricting the kind of space that I'm considering to a particular subspace in some sense. So rather than every which way my imagination can take me, I'm going to restrict it to, like assuming some kind of, some kind of like, I think what's going on is restricting it to this kind of consideration about the grounding of life, right? Where what it is to be life is grounded in terms of physical states or something. I think that's the universe of discourse is represented by that, but I'm not clear if that's exactly the issue.
And there was another term that you've used that I've heard frequently with respect to this discussion, and I've tried Googling it, which isn't necessarily always the best thing to do, but I try to look for the good resources when I Google, and that is psychophysical laws. Would you be willing to expand on what that term means? I'm actually genuinely curious myself.
Well, I mean, I'm a physicalist about mind, right? In terms of metaphysical possibility, right? I think that the psychophysical laws are metaphysically necessary, right? So in a sense, for me, fine-tuning in the physicalist sense is this interesting question, right? Because of the way that I think about things. But at least epistemically, it's a possibility for me that there might be different psychophysical laws. Now, what do I mean by psychophysical laws? I mean, we have as something to be explained that the idea that we have kind of like mental states or psychologies, right? The questions like consciousness, like what it's like to be something, right? And the question is, what's the relationship between that and the stuff that exists in the world? So suppose that we think that there's physical stuff like brains, whatever. Well, what's the relationship between mental states and brains and things? So is it that mental states just are identical to certain physical states? Is it the case that they supervene on them? I mean, is it the case that they're functionally realized? Or is it the case that there are, these different types of entities called souls which have mental states and they somehow interact with? So each of these states of affairs that I'm describing would be worlds with different psychophysical laws, right? Where the laws of that world which govern the kind of interactions, as it were, or the relationships between mental states and physical things would differ. So I'm saying that supposing that if we think that coming across a civilization where people where there are beings who fall in love and things like that is sufficient for life, right? Then if that can be realized in worlds that are just soul-based or whatever, non-physical with different psychophysical laws, then we have these examples of life where it's kind of irrelevant how the physical, how the physics of that world sort of varies, and I'm saying that then alters, our total kind of probability space for taking those into account.
So hopefully this isn't too simple, but would psychophysical law sort of be the metaphysical relations between the physical and the mental and the ways that they may relate? Is that?
Yeah, something like that is about right, I think. Yeah.
You can. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
You can maybe think of this in terms of like what physicists are doing when we're varying parameters is maybe we're just varying stuff on a plane, and we vary the parameters in this plane, and it turns out a very tiny area of this plane seems to permit life. If you add another axis where you're now varying something like the relationship between mental states and what's physically going on, well, it could be that actually we just happen to live on a plane where there's a very tiny area that's life permitting. But if you vary the psychophysical laws, there's actually so much area in those in that dimension which is life permitting, and so actually most of the parameter space turns out to be life permitting after all.
And so that clears up a question I was going to ask you guys, because it seemed that a point you guys were getting at there was that if we mean something different when we say life other than just physical life, we can perhaps drastically broaden that probability space of life permitting universes, and that can sort of affect this argument, but that somebody propounding the argument would probably have some sort of response to that. So
but it just might not be the case that our world is fine-tuned in that case, right? Because if the vast majority of the ways the world could have been are in fact life permitting, so say the vast majority of worlds, in fact, fundamental particles have consciousness. They're like panpsychist worlds or something. Well, and if you're going to say that those would be life forms, which again is going to be, this is going to be another contentious kind of philosophical thing about what commitments kind of are the upshot of accepting that those things would be life forms or not life forms. Well, then in that case, it's not going to be weird that our world is fine-tuned for life, right? Because most worlds, in fact, are fine-tuned for life. So, or not fine-tuned. Most worlds are life permitting, so they're just not fine-tuned. So it's not evidence.
So we've kind of, it seems at least, touched a bit on defenses for the fine-tuning argument. But before we get to like some objections, both good and bad, is there anything that either of you two would like to say more on the ways that the argument is popularly defended?
I think sometimes I think that people are becoming more aware of this, but I think people were sometimes neglected this before, is that it's not necessarily the case that these constants could be different. Okay, it's kind of a lot of the time when the fine-tuning argument is being presented, especially on the apologetic side, it's kind of assumed that physics already knows that these values can take these parameters can take lots of different values, and it's a very tiny subset that are life permitting. What we know in physics, I just want to make very clear, is simply that if we were to vary these parameters, if we were to vary their values, most of the results end up to be life prohibiting. But we know nothing about where these constants come from, or whether they can take any values at all, whether they can only take discrete values, whether they're continuous. This is something that is just unknown to physics at the moment, because these are the definition of these constants are that they're just numbers which we have to obtain from observation and experiment. We have no theoretical idea of where they come from yet. So it may be the case that you can't vary them. It may be the case that they can only take very specific values, and so actually it could be that a much higher percentage of the metaphysically possible values are life permitting. So there's this kind of consideration which I think is important as well. That yes, it's interesting, we can vary this, and most of it appears to be life prohibiting, but actually we don't really know where these constants come from, or what this actually corresponds to in reality. This exercise of varying them.
Okay. Yeah, I think I've got something to just build on that point that Matt said as well, because when we're talking about epistemic probabilities here, right? Like Matt says, it might be the case that it turns out, the values of these various constants could not have been different than what they in fact are, right? And so one line of thinking that some people have to the fine-tuning argument is to think, well, suppose I'm some sort of necessitarianist, right? Like a Spinozan, or something like that, right? Then I think that, in fact, the fine-tuning constants couldn't have been otherwise than they are. So surely the fact that the universe is fine-tuned isn't surprising. But I think that this is where going back to that kind of Bayesian form can actually be useful, right? Because the hypothesis of necessitarianism is just the hypothesis that everything that happens had to happen or couldn't have been otherwise, or something like that. But it doesn't make any particular claims, right, about what those things are that happens. So a hypothesis that says everything that had to happen, everything that happens had to happen, and the world is fine-tuned is a specific hypothesis, which is then going to have a much smaller prior probability than just a hypothesis that says, everything that happened has to in fact happen. So it might be, even if you're a necessitarianist of some stripe or other, that actually, the fine-tuning of the universe is fairly surprising when you find it out, right? I mean, presumably Spinoza was a kind of, necessitarianist, but if you told him about the fine-tuning, he would be like, oh, that's kind of, I didn't predict that on my theory or something. So it's still...
Would it be like... So could somebody ask, what is it similar to asking the question, well, so then why is it that these values are physically necessary over any other values, especially given that these values seem to be life permitting?
Exactly.
But you could turn that back into another fine-tuning argument almost, it seems.
Yeah, it's because we're talking about this epistemic probability, right, which is to do with for all we know. So if we have a theory that just says, everything that happens has to happen, it can't be otherwise or something, it doesn't say anything in particular about, what those things are that have to happen. And so, if we know that, it doesn't mean that I know that it's going to rain tomorrow or not rain tomorrow. It just means that whichever one of those things does happen couldn't have been otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Anything to add to that, Matt?
No, that's all good.
Alrighty. So some objections to the fine-tuning argument. This is one that I hear a lot. It's one I used to make, and after listening to people like Nathan and James Fodor and Matt, I don't make it anymore. But I'm curious what you guys think about this objection. Well, why the universe is fine-tuned for life, but like life, at least as we understand it, can't survive in like 99.9999999% of the universe, even a majority of the planet. Like we can't survive. Like the planet's 70% water. We drown in most of our own planet. So this doesn't seem to be a universe that the universe is so hostile to life. I just don't know how somebody could argue that it's finely tuned for the life that it's very hostile toward. How would you guys respond to that? Or first off, do you think it's a good objection? If so, why? And if not, why not?
I think actually in some sense, it is an interesting objection in that it can affect what our prior probability might be in accepting a kind of a theistic hypothesis as a response to this fine tuning, because most of the universe does appear to be, most of our planet, most of the universe appears to be very inhospitable to the existence of life, even though the universe as a whole has the constants which are necessary for the future evolution of life. But I still think this would be something that would be very surprising still on a theistic hypothesis. God doesn't necessarily have to choose, as far as we're aware. There doesn't seem to be a good reason to assume that God should choose these particular physical laws over some other ones that we haven't thought of or don't know anything about. There could be other laws out there where actually you create a space where 99% of it is very hospitable, very nice, very lovely to live in. So I think that this is an objection which I think it has something of interest going on there. It's not just, but when we are thinking about fine tuning, what we're talking about is we're saying that that in the possible parameter space of these varying these values, very few of the values of these sets of values of these constants will permit any sort of life whatsoever. And so our universe does appear to be fine-tuned, and that's irrelevant to the observation that most of our universe is actually inhospitable. We're lucky in a sense. It could be that none of the universe is hospitable at all, and that this is what occurs most of the time if you ran a universe picking random constants. So in that sense, that objection doesn't really have any force. There is this fine-tuning mystery. There is, I think, something to be explained as to why the constants have the values that they do. But I think that this does have some force when you're then considering hypotheses to try and explain the fine-tuning. I think it has a negative impact on theism.
Yeah, I broadly agree with what Matt said there. I think it just depends. I'd say it's not true that in light of what that objection says, right, that the universe is no longer fine-tuned for life in the sense that the fine-tuning proponent means. So that's the sense in which it's a bad objection, right, because it isn't actually engaging with what the fine-tuning proponent is arguing for, which is namely that it's surprising or that very few of the ways that the universe could have been, at least epistemically, are life permitting at all, whereas ours clearly is, given we're asking the question. However, if we're in the business of doing Bayesianism, we want to not be selective about the bits of evidence that we include, right? And the fact that only a localized region of our space has life in, or we might say, I mean, maybe this turns into a sort of problem of evil thing, but you might say, how difficult life is. People have to constantly work to get resources to keep shoving food in their mouths and keep their metabolisms going and so on. Given those sorts of things, you might say that those are actually pieces of evidence that are relatively unexpected, right? Given certain hypotheses, like that a loving creator who has the intention for conscious agents to thrive in that world, which is what people like Robin Collins kind of argue. You actually need to kind of bake into fine tuning, or that you need to kind of have some sense of like maybe moral realism or something that like conscious agents are incredibly valuable built into your fine tuning claim in order to get the likelihood, given theism, very high, like that God has these desires. Well, then you might say, well, look, taking into account my total evidence, which includes that most of the universe is very inhospitable to life, or that global warming on Earth means that maybe the Earth isn't going to be very hospitable to human life for much longer and stuff. You might actually say, and that's kind of not that's not predicted very much on this bare theism. Now, a theistic response might be to then come up with a specific form of theism, right, which has theodicies and things built in, claims about God wanting people to have free will in this particular way, and it's their fault. But then that's just a specific form of theism, and that's going to have a lower prior. And so then we've got to actually, we've got to look at what that actually does to the kind of Bayesian equation that we're coming up with.
Yeah, so it seems that what you guys are getting at here is that, like, sure, our universe is very largely, seemingly inhospitable to life as we understand it, but the fundamental parameters of the universe still permit the evolution of life, and that you could have a universe where it's like 70 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the whole universe, and there's like enough oxygen just present everywhere that like it would just be hospitable to life everywhere, but could have constants that just don't permit life to exist in it. And so that this objection might be tangentially related to the fine-tuning argument, but it's not really confounding the primary contention that a person running the argument would really have. Does that summarize what you guys are saying pretty well?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, and the other one that I wanted to touch on, this is another objection I hear. I'm myself not very fond of this. It goes something like, well, sure, if the parameters that govern our universe were different, the universe would look different. That's not surprising. That's just saying that if the universe were different, then it'd be different. What do you guys think of that one? Let's start with you, Nathan.
Okay, well, again, there could be something interesting in here, right? But it sort of depends on how the objection is framed. So if the claim is that if the universe, so I think if the claim is that if the universe were different, you wouldn't be asking the question at all, right? Well, then the kind of objection sort of dissolves. But if the claim is that if the universe were different, you'd be around and asking, the universe is different, and now you ask the question, well, is my universe fine-tuned for life or something? Then there's a sort of different problem that emerges, right? And that's from this observer selection effect thing. So the fact that kind of built into your background knowledge is the fact that you exist and you're asking this question, and what does that actually do to the kind of, what does that kind of do to the sort of answers that you come up with, right? So yeah, I think the point is that if these finely tuned constants were different than what they are, well, then you just wouldn't be able to ask the question at all. So given the fact that you're asking the question means that you're in one of these worlds that is life permitting, and given what we know about physics, right, we know that that varying them would mean you wouldn't be able to ask the question at all. So it's just not true that if they were different, you'd just be like, well, yeah, why is it fine tuned for me? Because it wouldn't be. You wouldn't be around to ask the question.
So yeah. Oh no, go ahead, Matt. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I also think that the objection kind of misses the point. It kind of misses what's interesting about fine-tuning. Fine-tuning is saying that epistemically, if you were to generate a random universe, you wouldn't expect it to be this one. This is not the kind of universe that we should expect to see if there was only one universe and we randomly generated it from the possible values, the constants. What we see is that there's this very atypical universe which exists, and if this was the result of some universe generating mechanism, if this is the only one that exists, this is not what we should expect to see. And so it's something that we then want to explain, because this is surprising. This is not something we expect to see. And so the fine-tuning argument that the fine-tuning argument without talking about God or theism or atheism or anything is just that we want to find an explanation for why this thing that we've observed is why it's a thing. So that's essentially what the fine-tuning argument is getting at. And so we don't expect to see this kind of universe if it's the only one that's produced and it's randomly generated from all the and its constants are randomly generated from all the possibilities. This isn't what we expect to see, so we want to explain it.
Well, that's all I had for bad objections. Those are really the two worst ones, I would say. Are there any others that you guys have heard that you'd like to talk about?
Just to add a little bit to the thing I was saying where the objection might be interesting is if you sort of say, if you provide some motivated reason, right, to think that the only worlds that we can talk about with any sort of plausibility are worlds where we can ask the question, why am I in this universe or something? Well, then I'm saying that objection, because then it's like, well, given that I'm asking the question, right, I'm in a life-permitting universe already, like I know that. And then the problem of fine-tuning sort of dissolves it. So it depends on, but then the fine-tuning advocate is probably going to say, well, that's just not the question that I'm asking, though, right? And so it's just two perspectives of thinking about it differently.
It seems that kind of relates to the anthropic principle a little bit, that we would only expect to see ourselves in a universe that would allow us to be in it. So why should we be surprised that we're in a universe that allows us to be in it? Because only universes that allow us to be in it, we would be in. So I guess that might be a good segue here. What do you guys think of the anthropic principle and its relation to the fine-tuning argument?
Well, the anthropic principle is something that's very sensible in that it's essentially a tautology. You know, if all it's saying is that we can't find ourselves in a non-life emitting universe. I mean, that's tautologist. It's not really saying anything. But what it's useful for is if you're then considering hypotheses to explain the fine tuning. Okay, so if you're considering something like a multiverse hypothesis, then the anthropic principle is something which then becomes useful, because you can say that even though I have this multitude of different universes, with all these various different constants, the reason I don't see the reason I don't exist in a non-life emitting universe is precisely because of the anthropic principle. And so what you can do once you've got a theory which with a multiverse model, and you can calculate some probabilities of what properties these various universes will have, what the probability distribution over the values of the constants will be in this multiverse, you can then use the anthropic principle to make the question of what we should expect to see sensible, meaningful. Okay, because if you just want to calculate if you have a multiverse and you just want to calculate the probability that a particular universe has the constants that we see here, that probability will still be very, very low even on a multiverse model. But that's not the interesting question to ask. The interesting question to ask once you have a multiverse model is that obviously, a la the anthropic principle, we can only exist in life-emitting universes. So what we want to do is we want to narrow down the space of what we're actually interested in just for those life-emitting universes, and then we want to see if the constants that we observe are typical, are likely amongst life-emitting universes. If these constants were very unlikely even amongst life-emitting universes, possibly it could be the case that there's a much, much, much more life-friendly universe than our own in the multiverse, with trillions upon trillions upon trillions of more life forms. If that was the case, we'd expect instead to exist in that universe, not this one. And so you'd still have a kind of problem. But what you can do is, once you have this multiverse model, the anthropic principle restricts it to a little subsection. And hopefully what we then find is that our values of the constants are just a fairly typical values amongst all these possibilities, and so that this is what we should expect to see. That's what a good explanation should end up doing. It should show you that what you're seeing is what you should have expected to see. Because if what you're actually seeing is extremely unlikely, then you've still got more to explain.
Yeah, I don't have that much more to say about the weak anthropic principle and strong anthropic principle and things like that. I mean, I don't tend to find it has too much bearing on my thinking about the argument, particularly as it pertains to God's existence. I think it might be maybe more interesting from the purely kind of physics-based project of investigating fine-tuning.
It's useful for evaluating multiverse models once you have them. That's what it's good for in physics. Yeah, sorry, I can go on.
No, that's it. I mean, that's a great conclusion to what I said. Like, the other thing is, I mean, there's something that's talked about along these lines is something to do with the observer selection effect, though, which I do think is closer to a sort of philosophical kind of conundrum, but that this can get deep in the weeds of kind of like Bayesianism and evidence and pure priors and things like that. And I'm not sure how it actually informs my thinking currently about the fine tuning, right? Because Elliot Sober, who's a philosopher and does a lot of stuff to do with probability, recently wrote last year, I think, a Cambridge Elements on Design Arguments, which has a thing on fine tuning where he says he's recently, changed his mind about the observer selection effect. So he thought, there was a problem with it, and now he doesn't anymore. And I've not quite figured out what he's, what he's saying there. But the idea is, something along the lines of what I was articulating before, which is just sort of like, given that you're asking the question, isn't it kind of built into your background knowledge that you exist? And then how does that affect, the kind of priors that are available to you for various hypotheses? and things like that. And that can just get fairly into the weeds. So the idea of an observer selection effect, I think, is something like, suppose I'm kind of fishing on a lake and I've got a net that has 10-inch holes in, and I get a bucket full of fish that are all greater than 10 inches long, and I kind of make an estimation that I make an estimation that the vast majority of the fish in this lake are longer than 10 inches long or something like that. Well, the problem is that the tool that I'm using to make my observations there, the net, right, is kind of inducing this selection effect where even if there were far more fish that are smaller than that, they'd get through the holes in the net. And the idea is that something similar like that might be going on in fine tuning, but I'm not exactly sure, how I kind of resolve how that bakes into my kind of evaluation of the fine tuning argument as a whole, right? Because there's this whole literature where a guy called Leslie has this thing called like this firing squad analogy where he's like, well, okay, so suppose this is analogous in the relevant sense, but you still want to postulate an explanation about why the firing squad didn't shoot you, right? And then there's all this stuff that I've just not made my mind up about at the minute.
So this is something I've looked into a lot recently, but I think maybe just for our purposes, it might just be easier just to say that what's not an issue is that if we knew that a multiverse existed with suitable properties, if we knew that existed, that would explain fine-tuning, full stop. There wouldn't be a problem anymore. We would know exactly why we see the constants that we do. There wouldn't be a problem anymore. What is an issue at the moment, because we don't know if such a thing exists, what is a problem at the moment is whether our observation that the universe appears to be fine-tuned, whether this counts as evidence, whether this makes more likely the hypothesis that such a multiverse does exist. So this is then getting on to what fine-tuning implies, or what makes more likely to be the case. And what's been argued a lot recently is whether or not this provides evidence for, or makes more likely, the existence of a multiverse. But what we've also just been discussing really is how a multiverse could explain the appearance of fine-tuning, and that's not an issue. That's never really been an issue. It would explain fine-tuning if it exists. What's this other issue that we're talking about is what we can say based on what we know so far about whether there's a multiverse or whether there's some other hypothesis that accounts for the fine-tuning that we observe.
So starting with you, Matt, what do you think of the multiverse being posited as an objection to the fine-tuning argument? Would you say it's a good objection, a bad objection? Do you think it really bears on the contention that the fine-tuning argument makes?
Well, I wouldn't say it's an objection. It's a resolution, okay. Really. I mean, not all multiverse models. You could easily get a multiverse model where actually the problem is exacerbated or it's made worse, where actually the kind of universe that we see is actually really, really unlikely, even among observers. So when we say multiverse, we're not just saying that any multiverse model, any multiverse idea whatsoever will solve this problem. That's not necessarily the case. But multiverse models with certain properties, which seem reasonable, based on the kind of ideas we get about multiverses in physics, these would solve the problem. They're a resolution. They're the explanation for why our universe would appear to be fine-tuned. So it's not an objection to the fine-tuning argument, in that what I see the fine-tuning argument, at least very, very weakly, what it's trying to say is just that our universe appears fine-tuned, and we want some explanation for this. Well, the multiverse model wouldn't make our universe appear any less fine-tuned, but it would resolve this problem.
Okay, so it's more of an explanation rather than an objection. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts, Nathan?
I think that what happens here is sort of an equivocation, right? When we talk about fine-tuning in the sense of the argument, right? Like, so is that an objection to the fine-tuning? You might say, sort of ordinarily, but what you mean there is in the sense that fine-tuning, is this argument that concludes that God exists and raises the probability of theism. So in that, if that's what's meant by is this an objection to fine-tuning, I think it is an objection to that. But I think the point that Matt has wanted to emphasize is that, well, fine-tuning should be couched in these more kind of theoretically neutral terms, right? So, and the problem is that because of its prominence as an apologetics argument, it's kind of in most people's head, it it immediately kind of rings these kind of alarm bells, right? Of argument for God's existence or something, and what do I have to say about that? Objections and so forth. So in that neutral sense, I agree with what Matt's saying, that it's just a resolution, and I do think that I mean, given a multiverse, or sometimes philosophically, I go with something called like modal realism, right? Which is the idea that every possible state of affairs is actual, which is it's different, but it does a similar thing argumentatively in terms of saying, well, it's just going to capture that whole. It's 100%. It's got a probability of one fine tuning given modal realism, or given certain types of multiverses, right? So the likelihood is going to just be as high as it possibly could be, which means that you're not reducing anything on the prior in that kind of Bayesian analysis. Whereas if on theism there's any other possibility that God might have like different desires, or bring about different forms of life or whatever, well, then it actually is going to have slightly less than one. So that's going to reduce the prior of theism in some sense. So maybe a multiverse or modal realism can then outcompete theism if they have kind of similar priors going into it. Something that's said about this recently by Philip Goff, I think he wrote in Nature or Scientific American or something, an article about the inverse gambler's fallacy, which was originally coined by Ian Hacking, I think, in the 70s, right? And the idea of the inverse gambler's fallacy is it's a sort of fallacy of independence. So the idea is, if there's I think you need to assume a bunch of things in the first place, right, to kind of get this going that might not be a part of the multiverse. But the idea is, if you've got a kind of universe generator, as it were, that's kind of randomly setting all these values, and it's random every time, well, then, stretching that out over an infinite time span or something like that doesn't actually improve the likelihood that this universe would be a finely tuned one, because each kind of roll of the dice, as it were, each universe that gets generated by such a machine is independent of the previous one. It doesn't kind of guarantee that this one is more like. Now, if you ask it, you can ask a slightly different question over an infinite time span, given such a random universe generating machine. What's the probability that some universe would be finely tuned? Well, then that's going to be high, but it doesn't make the probability that R1 is high, particularly high. But the problem is, I'm not actually sure that is what. Again, this is a physics question, right? But I'm not sure that is what the multiverse actually postulates. This kind of random universe generator over time. Maybe Matt can talk to that.
It depends a lot on what kind of multiverse kind of thing you're looking at. One of the typical examples, eternal inflation. So essentially, what you have is our universe kind of exists in a much larger kind of space time, and so the kind of first event, or what we can call the first event in our universe is the Big Bang. But before that, there's kind of this eternally inflating space time, and this space time keeps on inflating, and you only get Big Bangs in a certain localized region where this inflaton decays. Okay, so the inflaton kind of decays, inflation stops in that little patch, and a hot Big Bang begins. But this is something that only happens, is a probabilistic process, and it only happens in localized patches. So every now and then, somewhere else in this massive space, which is always inflating, so pushing all these little bubble universes apart, you get these little bubble universes forming. And the kind of vague kind of idea is that these different bubble universes could have slightly different values for their constants, slightly different effective laws at low energy scales. And so in that kind of sense, this kind of multiverse model is kind of similar to what's discussed in some of these philosophical inquiries. For all intents and purposes, you've just got this big space where a dice is being rolled, this chance event is happening, and a universe forms with certain properties. So in that sense, for maybe eternal inflation, this kind of thing is these kind of philosophical models are appropriate. For others, maybe if you have a multiverse model which is more like modal realism, where every possible physical universe exists, simpliciter, that's it. Then that's a different possibility that requires different considerations. But yeah, generally, what's considered in the by philosophers, it seems, at the moment is just to assess the claim of assess the hypothesis of whether there's just more than one universe, and with randomized properties, and that whether increasing the number of universes increases the likelihood of seeing a fine-tuned universe, or of this universe being fine-tuned, or of a universe being fine-tuned. So it depends on the multiverse model, but I think this is definitely the way that they're discussing it in the literature is appropriate, certainly for very plausible multiverse models.
I think what I kind of object to in Goff's framing is that he seems to me to be framing this inverse gambler's fallacy as like this knockdown objection to postulating sort of atheistic alternatives such as the multiverse, right? And he's right that it is an apt objection to certain models, but he's not right that it's an apt objection to all models. And I don't think he's careful to distinct. So for example, in his appearance on like Capturing Christianity, when he's talking to an audience of people who are sympathetic towards, any responses to objections to fine tuning to make the argument stronger, he's saying things like, people who do this sort of thing, like come up with some atheistic alternative like a multiverse, are just in denial about it, right? Whereas I think what he himself isn't doing is not being careful enough to actually disambiguate between the specific models which might be committing the inverse gambler's fallacy and various different models which aren't doing that and would be atheistic alternatives, right? And I think if he did that, I'd be far happier, because then I'd be like, well, that's a useful contribution, right? There is an inverse gambler's fallacy sort of taking place in some of these inferences, but not in all. It's not the case that, like, if you're an atheist, right, who rejects the fine-tuning argument because you think it's more strongly predicted by some other hypothesis, that you are therefore committing the inverse gambler's fallacy or something. And that's what I see him as having kind of encouraged with some of his talks recently.
So I think it was you, Nathan, might have sort of alluded to this, or maybe it was Matt. I think maybe it was both of you. I can't really remember. But with respect to objections to the fine-tuning argument, what do you guys think of the objections that are given? Like, well, God's omnipotent. Why would he need to fine-tune like he could just put life in any universe that he wanted to? Or also things like, well, we can't really appeal to like God's desires to know what he would want with respect to the creating a universe. Do you guys think that these objections really bear well on the fine-tuning argument or not?
Do you mean now objections that an atheist might have to fine-tuning in the sense of providing evidence for the existence of a God? Is that a sense in which you mean objection? Yeah. I would say you say yeah. So I've forgotten the latter already, but the former certainly is something that I think is quite obviously a problem, because if you have an omnipotent God and you leave it at that, just saying, yeah, he's omnipotent, he can do anything, well then this, as we were saying earlier, this completely changes the landscape of possibilities, and suddenly you could be looking at a landscape where actually there's loads of space in this possibility space where universes are life emitting. So this, and even though this hypothesis is increasing the chance maybe that the life emitting universe will be created, what it actually does is in my mind, it seems to reduce very drastically the possibility that this one in particular will be created. This universe seems a very strange, inefficient choice for the kind of desires that are commonly attributed to God. And even within these physical laws themselves, as we know them, so as I was saying, physicists deal with this very small, restricted area of all the epistemic possibilities you could think of. Even in this space, we're not in what would be more likely to be a more optimal universe for life. Okay, when you calculate some indicators for what might be a good universe for life, one that seems fairly obvious is the number of stars. Okay, for our kind of life, the more stars you have, it seems the better. Yeah, you get more elements being produced, you get more possibility of planets, you get stars are the kind of structures that are essential for us to evolve and develop, and so it seems that a universe with more stars will be better. Now, when we've run there was a study that I saw at a conference not that long ago that was really interesting, and our universe is really not optimal at all for star production. There are you could change the cosmological constant just a bit, and you get a far larger quantity of stars if you just change this particular parameter and change nothing else. And so there seems to be some reason to suggest that actually there are better, more life-friendly universes within our set of physical laws that we know of than the one that we currently find ourselves in. And so I think this raises a major problem, I think this raises a major problem for someone who wants to suggest that an omnipotent God who wanted to create life such as us exists as a resolution to fine-tuning, because it's this kind of the best of all possible worlds thing. You expect an omnipotent, all-loving God to create the best possible world, and even within these physical laws, it seems that that's not the case. I question, for a start, why choose these physical laws, but even within the physical laws, this doesn't seem to be the case. There seems to be lots of different values you could set this cosmological constant to, and you get far more stars. And although this isn't a knockdown indicator, this isn't saying that, oh yeah, you definitely get better life in these universes, but it doesn't. It seems to be a decent indicator of a universe that would be better. And so what I think is a major problem for the theistic hypothesis is saying, why these particular values? On a non-theistic or a multiverse hypothesis, all you need to do is you just need to show that these particular values are likely ones for observers to see. If you do that, then you've explained fine-tuning. But a theistic hypothesis has to do something much more drastic. You've got to show why this particular set of values are. You've got to explain why those are the ones that God chose, and that seems to be a very dangerous task when you have a God who's got properties such as omnipotence and omnibenevolence.
Just by the way, the second one that I was asking was, because for me, with respect to omnipotence, myself, as I understand it, I just take omnipotence to be God could actualize any logically consistent state of affairs. It seems that an omnipotent being doesn't have means to its ends. It's just the ends, because why would you need a means to accomplish an end if you're omnipotent? So if somebody's going to try to argue, well, God did it this way as a means to his end, that seems to threaten his omnipotence. But God's desires, why would God desire a universe like this? And can the theist really appeal to God's desires? Can the theist really know what God's desires are such that they can appeal to God's desires to help explain why we have the universe that we do? But I think, Nathan, you wanted to jump in there?
I was just going to say, I think your criticism there is a correct one, right? That it's kind of inconsistent, potentially at least inconsistent with the hypothesis to postulate these desires and things. But I think that the inconsistency is perhaps not between God's omnipotence and having these desires. Because if omnipotence is just the thesis that God has the powers to bring about all possible states of affairs, that's a statement about what God kind of can and can't do, namely that there's nothing that he can't do that's possible. But the statement about God having these desires to do something, well, there's a few things going on there, right? One of them is going to be to do with like God's alleged aseity, so the idea that God's kind of the greatest thing, or maybe that God is perfect, God is self-sufficient, and these are the sort of properties that belong to. It's going to depend upon the characterization of theism that's going to be given, right? Which is, you're going to have to take the theist on their own terms. You can't sort of say to the theist, well, look, you believe in a square circle, so your God hypothesis entails a square circle, and they're like, no, it doesn't. You can't just tell them what they believe. But I mean, at least a lot of theists are committed to various attributes of God, like being perfect and self-sufficient and so on. And so this idea of having any desires at all, right, seems to imply a sort of lack in some sense, which seems inconsistent with this idea of being self-sufficient. And there's all sorts of problems in that region. The other The other problem that's in that vicinity is the idea of discerning divine psychology to decide what God would have reasons to do. So as I've kind of implied, right, I tend not to think that God would have any reasons to do anything. But even if I modify my theistic hypothesis slightly, so God might be lacking something, you get these questions, right, about, well, why would God care about having, like carbon-based life forms with brains on rocky planets from the sun, rather than like just angels or like soul-based beings or whatever heaven's supposed to be like, right? And that alters again the likelihood part of the Bayesian equation, which is how expected is this given theism, right? And I think sort of, well, either indiscernible, I just can't put a value on that at all, so I can't get the argument to work in favor of theism because I just don't know what likelihood to attribute, or it's going to at least reduce it so as then that affects, take into account with the prior how theism compares to other hypotheses.
That sort of leads into another, and for me, I would think that it's probably an objection, but it is a genuine question that I have, and that's, how do we reasonably establish the expectation value for a life-permitting universe, given really any like broader metaphysical framework, naturalism, theism, or some other, esoteric metaphysical framework that somebody comes up with? Is there really like a sound methodology for establishing an expectation value? And can we really show that the expectation for a life-permitting universe is actually higher given theism than given other metaphysical frameworks? It seems to me that there really isn't a solid way to do either of those. But like I said, my understanding of statistics and probability isn't very well developed, so I could be missing something.
I think generally for any really big metaphysical hypothesis like naturalism or theism, or even any particular kind of theism, you're doing some hand waving in trying to establish what the expectation value would be, because you don't really have the probabilities that you're putting on these things are quite subjective. There's no objective way you can put. There's no clear value we can put on for the objective probability that God would choose carbon-based life forms over paint-based life forms or anything. You could say that one seems to be higher than the other, but there's no real. You can't be very precise in this at all. There's no real precise reason you can give for that, other than kind of feelings. What is nice, and why I think that this is going to be a question which ends up with a scientific answer, is that this is something that you can do once you have a suitable multiverse model. In a multiverse model, if you know how universes are generated, if you know the mechanism by which constants are selected, how the values are selected, then you've got, and if this is a probabilistic process, then you have a probability distribution over the different universes that you'll get produced. And so once you've got this, you can then say very clearly what the probability is that we should see a universe with this particular value of the constants. How many universes out there don't have these constants? How many universes out there are life emitting? What percentage of them? So you can get very good expectation values once you have a physical model like that. And so I think that this is such a great reason why we should pursue kind of naturalistic attempts, obviously based on science, to solving this question, because we can actually, at the end of the day, end up with an answer that will make sense. If we find a certain multiverse exists and has a certain mechanism, we can then calculate the expectation value that we see the constants that we do. If it comes back likely, good, we've solved the problem. Whereas these other hypotheses, all these different metaphysical ideas, and especially theistic hypotheses, I don't think I'd find the answer satisfying, even if the God of kind of Christian theism existed. That wouldn't really be a satisfying resolution to me. I'd still feel like I have the question, well, why this particular universe? Why this particular law? Why these particular values? It doesn't seem to me like a hypothesis which is actually going to solve the problem very well.
I don't think that, and that's something that I've always thought is, hopefully I'm not butchering your position here. Hopefully I'm accurately representing it, that God doesn't really seem to explain this, because again, if he's omnipotent, he could have done any values. It doesn't explain why God selected these values, why God wanted specifically carbon-based life. I mean, it doesn't seem that theism really explains why we see what we see. It seems to just sort of, I really don't want to say this because I don't think this is what the argument is trying to do. I really don't, but it almost kind of seems like a God of the gaps. And I really hate charging theists with that. I really try not to if I don't have to, but do you guys see kind of where I'm going with that, though? It kind of just seems like you're just saying, oh, well, God did it. And that's that.
The way I sort of, I don't know if I would frame it. I do have problems with the proposed theistic explanation. I don't know if I would frame it as God of the gaps, but I do think there's something that I see as maybe, sort of pernicious about the argument in the way that it's used persuasively, right? Is that I think a lot of, persuasively in an apologetics context, I think a lot of these issues get kind of swept under the rug, right? And the argument gets presented as though there are just these crazy numbers which physics generates, and if you deny them, then you're just in conflict with the science, and it's only because of the darkness of sin, or because you're a motivated reasoner, that you deny that any other competing explanation just can't explain can't explain why the values are what they are, right? And that's the way that it gets framed. It's like this kind of spiky hedgehog on the outside with all of these all of these sort of weaponized scientific terms. I think even the Bayesian framework, while I've said it's useful when people want to think about what's going on, can be weaponized, because then you start talking about, you're intimidating people with all of these scientific facts, you're intimidating people with talk of hypotheses and evidence and probabilities and things. So if you're well versed in this argument and you're coming out with it, it looks like it's almost like a scientific conclusion that God exists or something. And that is the way that I see this argument being used in the discourse. And I sort of dislike that. It frustrates me about the use of the argument. In terms of the naturalistic research program, right, of asking this question about the universe being fine-tuned for physical life, right, where physical life means this particular type of life that is grounded in more fundamental to it, the physical states of affairs, whatever. I think that's a perfectly legitimate and interesting question with an interesting research program behind it. But I do think that asking that question is in some sense inconsistent with postulating that there's a disembodied mind called God that explains it, because I think that would be a life form that is that is a counterexample to the definition of life that's being built into the definition of fine-tuning there, right? So I think that can be an interesting question, whereas when theists want to kind of change the game up by introducing God as a hypothesis, I think they have to do so in a way where they're now talking about this different probability landscape, which has various different ways the world could have been, different psychophysical laws and things like that. And then honestly, I mean, maybe the argument still works, like, for all I know, but I just have absolutely no idea, because the probability space is so different and there's so much varying. There's literally no constraints then, other than ways I can kind of tell a story that doesn't seem to involve a logical contradiction, like about as like Neil Simbabu does, electrons falling in love or so on, or like muons building their souls and going to war and stuff. Like I can tell stories about that, and it's not clear that there's any contradictions in them. So
wait, Nathan, you're telling me you haven't heard about the Great Muon Wars of 1842?
Right, exactly. And at that point, I just have absolutely no idea what to make of the probability space. Like, how many of those worlds are life permitting? I mean, maybe still, the minority of them are, because maybe there's more ways of telling, logically consistent stories about things. But I think it's going to be at least innumerably infinite, and something like that. So I just don't know. Like, there's going to be innumerably infinite, that is, of life permitting and non-life permitting ones. And so I don't know. I just don't know what to make of it, if that's a possibility space.
We've been talking about this probability space, and this is another thing I'm kind of speaking out loud. I don't know if it's a good objection. I'd like to get you guys' opinion. If God desired to create a physical reality with life in it, does it seem counterintuitive to you guys that the probability space of or rather those kinds of universes that would be life permitting would occupy such an extraordinarily small region of that probability space. It seems to me, to use an analogy, that you build a machine and you want it to create these types of widgets called glues, but you restrict its ability to create glues such that it's very, very, very improbable that the machine would actually produce glues. It almost seems like that's what God did. He wanted a universe in a certain way and then restricted the probability space such that it's very, very highly improbable that you would get that kind of universe. Do you guys see where I'm going with this?
Well, yeah.
Reasonable
I mean, so it depends. It would depend on what reasons you'd have for God wanting to create a physical universe as opposed to any others. If there are very good reasons for creating a physical universe, and it's just so happened that in any physical universe there's only a very small subset of possibilities which are life permitting, then perhaps this can make sense. But what essentially, as Nathan's been saying, what the theist has to do really is they have to explain why God should want to create a physical universe, what the reasons for doing that are, over a universe with disembodied minds or just any other universe that doesn't have the kind of form of laws that we know. And I think that's a challenge that is certainly, you're going to lose precision and lose a lot of, and potentially be talking about completely meaningless ideas when you're talking about that. It just seems a very difficult, dangerous kind of activity it doesn't seem like something that I'm going to trust what they're saying very much.
Mm-hmm. And it seems then that goes back to like God's omnipotence. It seems to be threatening to God's omnipotence if he could only create a physical universe in one or at least a very, very small amount of ways. And then also, if somebody's like a classical theist and holds to the concept of aseity, God desired to create a universe. Why would God desire anything at all? He is perfect. And it seems that we could almost start going back then to those kinds of objections with respect to at least the fine-tuning argument establishing like a theistic God.
I think what theists and apologists, I think, really want to do is they want to say, well, I've got this really good hypothesis for why the universe is fine-tuned. A God who wants life to exist exists, and so that's why life exists. And so the probability that the probability that life exists and that a universe that permits life exists is 1. Now, yeah, that's fine, but you're missing out on all the kind of things which then cause problems for that hypothesis, which is why this particular life, why these particular values of the constants, why these particular laws, why these particular psychophysical laws. And that's when this hypothesis is no longer a nice, simple, unifying hypothesis. It's a really complicated, convoluted, mysterious, very weird, and leaves open loads of mysteries and anomalies that don't really make a lot of sense.
I think what's worth keeping in mind in terms, if we sort of recall back to that Bayesian formulation, right, where we've got our prior, and then we multiply that by the kind of likelihood, right, to get our kind of final posterior. Well, the prior of theism, theism includes, like Christian theism, Islamic theism, maybe various forms of like Hinduism and things like that. So that is, theism, just bare theism, has a much higher prior than some specific form of theism. And I think that what a lot of people do when confronted with these questions who are theists is they start bringing various considerations from their theology of a specific theism to bear on their evaluation of God's desires. So they think, well, look, like, of course God would want to create this world because I know that God loves all men or something like that. So, what God has to create man and he loves it. So, this is the sort of way that I think people start thinking about these things who are theists when they're faced with these objections. But the problem with that is the type of theism that they're talking about is a subset of theism. So as I said, you've got like all of the theisms, right, which contains like Christian theism, Islamic theism. So as soon as you draw on your specific theology to say, well, no, I'm talking about Christian theism, now you're talking about a smaller prior. And so even if the likelihood is better, the prior is going to come down, and it's sort of like, are you really getting that much more for doing that? It's kind of a little bit unclear. And maybe, and like I say, maybe it could be the case that someone does that and fine-tuning once they get 100% of the probability space, then because they get the likelihood so high by baking all these things in, well then that then they're doing really well, right? But you've got all these other hypotheses like Lewisian modal realism or whatever, which also get 100% of the likelihood. And is the prior of Lewisian modal realism that much lower than like a specific form of theism that has all of these theological things baked in? I'm just not sure, So
I've got one more, what I think is an objection to at least the fine-tuning establishing like a theistic God or trying to like disestablish naturalism. And then I want to hear from you guys, like how you guys would object to it. And that's, so let's say we grant fine-tuning, let's say we grant it's fine-tuning for life, and let's say we grant that there's an agent that did it. Couldn't I just postulate that it could be some sort of hyperdimensional beings who wanted to create us as some sort of simulation or something like that and still be able to rescue sort of a naturalistic framework while at the same time granting that our universe was fine-tuned for life by some agent? Do you think that that's an objection that one could run, or do you think that maybe that misses some of the points that the argument tries to make with respect to objecting to naturalism?
I think this is kind of like a kind of simulation hypothesis kind of thing.
Sort of, yeah. That's one way you could do it, yeah.
Well, it depends. It's because at this point, that hypothesis on its own might not necessarily it might not necessarily lead to a likelihood of one. Okay, if you have a theistic God, the probability that life's going to exist, that this universe is created, seems to be one. On that hypothesis, where you kind of got these hyperdimensional beings fiddling around and maybe creating a simulation, doesn't necessarily have to be one. It seems like it could be slightly lower, and so maybe it's less likely in that sense. But let's assume that say both of these hypotheses end up with a life-emitting universe with a likelihood of one. Well, then what you then need to do is you then need to start comparing these hypotheses. Are they simple? Are they unified? And you're looking at these kind of virtues. I think perhaps that the theistic God might win out over this scenario because it seems to be it's possibly simpler. It's possibly a simpler hypothesis. Not necessarily, because maybe you could say that these hyperdimensional beings are just like us, but kind of higher up, and you've got it's turtles all the way down. It's these simulated realities all the way down. And so actually, this theory is more parsimonious because it's all the same stuff. But I mean, then it seems quite convoluted in how many layers are there, it seems like the hypothesis you suggested leaves a lot more to learn, a lot more to question. Whereas a God kind of at least feels the end of the line. There's some reasons to think it can be quite a simple hypothesis, and it doesn't necessarily lead to more questions. That's why I think actually theism might win out over a scenario like that. But I think the problem with a theistic scenario is that actually it's not that simple. Actually, there's a lot of things that it can't explain with regards to why these particular physical laws, why these particular constants. Whereas something like naturalism, I think, based on science that we know, can fare much better.
Yeah, I agree with everything Matt's just said. I mean, I think it could be a useful thing to do in some circumstances to sort with some fine-tuning proponents to show them that you can come up with kind of contrived explanations, right, which are obviously wrong. So they're going to kind of go, look, there's obviously something up with that, and to show that a lot of the moves that are being made by the theist proponent of a fine-tuning argument are kind of available to anyone who wants to cook up a sort of contrived hypothesis, right? And again, it's going to depend on the particulars of that conversation, but maybe you can start, like introducing different kind of metaphysical rules and things for these entities, like alien simplicity or something, which then changes the status of the prize and things like that. And the purpose of doing that might just be to show that there's kind of either special pleading or something going on in the case of the theists arguing, or they're kind of like changing the rules and doing something that's unfair, or at least that's going to be unpersuasive to someone who's not already convinced of the conclusion. So it could be a useful thing to do in some circumstances. But I agree with Matt that if I'm actually concerned with comparing that hypothesis as an explanation of fine-tuning to like theism or something, there's at least on the face of it, there are all these problems, but it's also not clear that those problems aren't really there for theism, and they're not just kind of like masked by just kind of God gets to have desires or whatever for free, right?
Mm-hmm. I feel like the only reason, if I were to bring that objection, would be just to show that, look, I can grant like your entire argument, and still at the end of the day, there are ways that I could rescue naturalism. But I definitely agree with, if somebody's going to seriously run that, then that just comes down to comparing that model with the theistic model and seeing which one then would actually be more parsimonious with providing an explanation for the fine-tuning of our universe. So going into you guys, what you guys think are, how you guys would best object to it. Let's start with you, Matt. What do you think your best objection, if you were in a debate with Luke Barnes or Robin Collins, maybe you have been, how would you respond to their argument? What's the first objection or couple of objections you would give?
I've been in discussions with them. I'm not sure how well I'd fare in a debate with them. I'm not sure how good my debating skills are. I prefer nice discussions like this. So I think if I was talking to Luke Barnes, for example, I think it's very obvious that our universe has the appearance of fine-tuning. This is something which I don't disagree with. I think the evidence is very strong for, and there's something to be explained here. And so the objections that I'm going to then have is over what seems like a good explanation and what doesn't seem like a good explanation. And for me, I think that looking at what naturalism has to offer, at the moment it seems to be in the form of these kind of multiverse hypotheses and the different multiverse models which generate universes via different mechanisms, different probabilistic mechanisms. This seems to be a hypothesis which has the potential to explain fine-tuning, but not only just to explain it, but to give actual kind of predictive power. It can predict what we expect to see, and then we can compare this to what we actually see, and we can actually evaluate these models very precisely and very well. Contrast that with a theistic hypothesis. Yes, it solves fine-tuning in the sense that it makes it very likely that a life-emitting universe would exist, but I think it really lacks precision. And in order to obtain the precision that a naturalistic hypothesis has, it then has to include all sorts of assumptions, which I think then make the hypothesis much more, reduces the prior of the hypothesis much more.
What about you, Nathan?
I think I've sort of articulated, several points to do with how I tend to think about this, or things that are concerning for me, and so as such, I kind of don't find it convincing. I mean, the main one for me is to do with this, what it means for something to be fine-tuned for physical life, right? Which I agree, our universe is fine-tuned for physical life, but I think that what that breaks down to is this claim about I think that embedded within the claim that our universe is fine-tuned for physical life is this claim that minds supervene or are grounded in physical states of affairs, right? So that's to say there are no possible worlds in our kind of assessment of the probability landscape, which include things like, disembodied souls and things like that, disembodied minds that love each other and have, complicated lives and things. So then I think if that's right, that's actually going to rule out postulating as an explanation a disembodied mind, right? Because built into the thing that we're trying to explain just is this claim that there aren't such things as disembodied minds and things. So that's going to just rule out God as a hypothesis from my point of view. And then obviously there are things that could be said in response to that, right? So, for example, denying that the kind of examples that I've given, like ensouled life, would actually be life forms, might be one of them. Perhaps claiming that there's only a couple of ways that things could be. There's like a disembodied God mind, and there's physically supervenient brains, and that's the possibility space. That might be one way people would go. And then there are things I can say in response to those sorts of objections. Let me think. Is there anything else that I think is just there's a discussion to be had there, right? I guess is all, and there's a back and forth. But for me, this just raises enough questions to sort of at least justify me in withholding assent, right, from the theistic conclusion. And maybe as I explore that further, it'll leave me in a place where I'm like, look, clearly fine-tuning just doesn't favor theism at all. There's these better explanations, or it's completely inconsistent. But that at least does enough work, I think, to justify me or anyone else, right, in sort of saying, I'm just not sure about theism here that actually is favored by fine-tuning.
I think another thing that I've thought about is, I think I could grant that the fundamental constants and parameters, or their values rather, are finely tuned for physical life. But if we're looking at the constants and the parameters that sort of sit at the bottom of reality, so to speak, I think I'm tempted to say, barring a multiverse, that there just isn't an explanation for that. That is the bottom of reality. There's nothing beyond that. There's no explanation. Like, that's just the way that it is. And I realize that particularly for theists, that's going to be sort of an unsatisfactory answer. But for me, I do think the idea that the universe, again, barring, multiverse hypotheses, largely is just a brute contingency, and the things sitting at the bottom of it are just brutally, like, the universe just is the way that it is, and that's just it. There is no explanation. There isn't a why these constants have the value that they do. That's the value. I think I would also say perhaps there's a small amount of contrivance in what the values are, in the sense that we sort of prescribe that value based on the numerical systems that we do, unless when we talk about the values, we're not talking about the ways that we, like, the prescriptions that we give that sort of quantify them, but the actual objectively there thing that is being quantified. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that, on either of those.
We're talking about what kind of is ultimately there. It's safe to kind of stay in, as a naturalist, it's safest to stay within the bubble of kind of accepted science, and to have a little excursions out and wonder what might be next in the scientific story, but maybe not to venture too far. If you do want to venture further, which is something that I definitely think about, I would be very concerned. It seems very strange to me if there were brute contingencies. That to me feels like something that it feels almost unnatural. It would feel to me to be something very unsatisfying, something very mysterious and strange. So in my kind, so for me, what that would mean is that something exists necessarily. Now, what if we explore this train of thought and think maybe what might satisfy us in the end, if we got to the bottom of reality and we'd learned something about it, what could it be that would satisfy us? When I think of that, we think about the constants in the physical laws. Now, it could turn out that these constants that we've been talking about are entirely predicted within the final theory of everything of physics that if we end up discovering it. It could be the case that all these values are predicted. They couldn't have been any other way within these physical laws, within this physical framework. But even if you got to that stage, you're still then left with the question of, say, why does this physical framework describe our universe? Why does why do these laws apply? Why not these other kind of laws which we can cook up, we can just write down with mathematics? And to me, in my mind, the only idea that I find to be plausible as a next step in this is to say that, well, mathematical systems are themselves universes. Mathematical systems are actually physical. They are what physical things and mathematical things become the same thing. Every mathematical system is a physical system. And so then reality for me is all these mathematical systems out there, and we happen to inhabit one of them. And this to me kind of gets rid of brute contingencies, because mathematics does have this kind of necessary air about it. Whether you call it a necessary entity is something more controversial, but it has the air of necessity about it. But then it also explains why mathematics is so good at explaining the world we happen to inhabit, because it is a mathematical system. So it gets rid of brute contingencies. It explains some problems in some mysteries in physics and science. And I think it also answers this question of, would I be satisfied if I ended up we dug down further and further, and we found that there's just a physical theory and we can't get any further. This to me then seems like the kind of explanation which would satisfy me, and I could see it being a complete explanation. But that's a very kind of hypothetical exploration past naturalism, and that's kind of the almost, it's like the worldview I have in my head, which is that I have as kind of the best explanation so far, and whatever I knew I learned, I test against that, see if there's something else that makes more sense. But that's the kind of thing. So I would argue that there's no brute contingencies, and I'd be worried if something looked like one.
So I'm just thinking in terms of investigating this kind of hypothesis that whatever reality is, it is like there's just these kind of brute contingencies, right? The values being what they are. So when we find out that our universe takes particular values, right, that's actually going to have a very small likelihood given that hypothesis. So because, okay, the values are what they are. They're brutally contingently, they're those values, but they could have been any of these values, right? So when we find out what they are, that's going to have an incredibly low likelihood. So I think that's not going to kind of win out as a posterior after fine tuning. Now you could then bake into the hypothesis that they're brutally contingent and they're these values, but then that's going to then it's going to be basically the same thing, right? Because you've got the prior of them being brutally contingent, and then you've got within that space they're brutally contingent and they're this value, they're brutally contingent and they're this value, and you're just picking that one, and all you've basically just done the same equation there, right? And so it's still going to come out very, very small. And so yeah, I sort of tend to think that's not going to win out as an explanation of fine tuning. I have no idea what's going to happen because I sort of tend to think I just don't know enough physics, right, to predict. I have a hunch that we'll modify and revise our physics, and maybe there'll be, at least some theoretically deeper thing. I mean, I think words like deepness, right, are sort of prone to ambiguity because it starts sounding like Deepak Chopra or something very quickly. But I think there might be something that sort of unifies these things theoretically as something that's useful. And I'm guessing that thing won't be God, though my guess is at that point, there'll still be further questions, right? Because short of omniscience, there's always going to be further questions. And what happens, I think, from a meta standpoint, what we have to look at is, well, what's really going on in explanation? Are we explaining things to satisfy our own ignorance in a sense, or are we explaining things to get at the relations between things in the world? And I think there's a bit of kind of both things going on, right? And there's a sense in which, regardless of how far we ever explain things short of omniscience, we're always going to be cognitively dissatisfied to some degree. And so we're always going to be able to ask the question, but why this one rather than that or something, right? And you can kind of, and at that point, it's always going to be open to someone to just kind of postulate a natural necessity. And it's always going to be open to someone to postulate a contingency of the choice, but the product of God's desires or something, because you can just do that with these metaphysical explanations by postulation. But I think there's a bit further for the physics to go. Is my
certainly. You're right there.
There was one more thing I wanted to run by you guys. If it's possible that the values for the constants and parameters, which I don't really like this language, which govern our universe, could take any value from negative infinity to infinity, it seems to me then either we'd have, if that's a thing that could be the case, which I personally don't see why it couldn't be, that either A, there's an equal chance that literally any value from negative infinity to infinity could be taken, and the ones we see are just the ones that were taken, or B, there's going to be some higher probability of the values that we see being taken by a universe over other values, which seems to me then that there's just a higher probability. Maybe we could further explain that, or it's just going to be physically necessary that the values that we see are the ones that are going to be taken. What do you guys think of this?
Well, so I think the probability that the constants take a particular value that they do will just be determined by whatever essentially comes next. If you're a theist, you might think God. If you're someone like me, I think that there's probably a certain universe generating mechanism. Or actually, I think there could be a mix. So for some of these constants, it could be the case that their values are determined by higher energy laws. Okay, so what we deal with in physics are low energy laws. What we've done is we've essentially, there's this high level theory that we don't know about, but because we're working at low energies, certain degrees of freedom in that high energy theory drop out. We don't need to worry about them, and they kind of freeze in as these values of the constants. So it could be the case that when we get to that high energy theory, some of these constant values are necessary. They had to be that way. Or it could be the case that some of them are determined probabilistically. There was some quantum process, which is, all, as far as we know, always probabilistic. And so the value that it ends up taking in a certain region of space-time ends up is just probabilistic. So these could come from different sources. The question of fine-tuning is how we explain the values of the constants that we have here. And so long as we have some overarching mechanism where we expect to see the constants that we do, then fine-tuning has been explained, at least in that sense.
I think in some sense, if I've understood your question correctly, Leo, like it could make the sort of fine-tuning even weirder, because I think what your question was imagine that the entire possibility space is all of these kind of free parameters taking values from -infinity to +infinity, right? And I think that if that's the entire possibility space, then that's actually an even more unrestricted space than the one that's ordinarily being considered. Because I think, as Matt said earlier, oftentimes there's actually only a kind of set of finite ranges being considered.
Yeah.
And even within that space, it's a very small amount. So if you just expand that space even further, right, you get more and more extreme things happening, you know, with whatever, like strong or weak nuclear force doing crazy things, ripping things.
Muons going to war, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Electrons falling in love.
but I think at least the ones at those extremes, though, there is, of course, there are lots of questions, right, about what's going, like, are all of them independent of each other, right? Or what happens when you vary, even if supposing they are independent, what happens when you vary multiple free parameters at the same time rather than just varying one at a time and things like that. And look, there's, you know, I think Luke Barnes has done some stuff where he's responded to some of these like questions like that raised by Victor Stenger. But then there's also other physicists who say slightly different things to the things that Luke Barnes cites that are slightly more recent. So I'm just really not sure, and I think that that's a question for the physicists. But I still do think I don't think it's overwhelmingly obvious, you know, that that most of these kind of ways things could have been are life permitting in the physical sense.
You touch on something that I've actually thought about a lot, and that's the covariance of these of the values of the constants and parameters. So you vary one, and then like you get a universe of life just can't exist in it. But then you vary a few others, and the universe looks different, but you could still get physical life in it. That sure, if you vary one, you could destroy it, but if you take all of them together, what are the different ways in which they could co-vary where you might still be able to get life? That's always been an interesting. I spend a lot of time thinking about that. I guess that's what I want to say.
I think it's not something I personally think about a lot. I think it's because a lot of these parameters affect very, very different things. For example, if you're varying, say, the strength of the weak nuclear force, I mean, you can make that as crazy as you like, but it won't affect, for example, if you set the cosmological constant to be massive, it won't. That universe, whatever the value of the weak constant, will just zoom apart and nothing happens. So, you know, for each of these constants, they're affecting something quite particular. The expansion rate of the universe, the initial fluctuations, the weak force. These are very different things. Yeah, the strength of the forces. So these are very different things. And so there's kind of a range on all of them. We're actually only within a very small range, regardless of whatever you're doing to the rest of the things. You're going to end up, if you stray out of this range, with a just ridiculous universe, which won't have anything interesting going on, regardless of the values of the other ones.
Okay,
so I think sense. So one thing, you know, that I sort of mentioned was I think it's still an open question in physics whether some of them are like dependent on one another, right? So the idea that you could vary one while keeping another the same might just be an incoherent idea. And if that's right, then that's going to alter the probability landscape, right? Because then all those worlds where you're like, well, I keep this one the same and I vary that, they're no longer actual possibilities. And so that changes the landscape of the kind of answer to whether or not our universe is fine-tuned in the relevant sense. But yeah, in terms of So Victor Stenger raised, this kind of objection that a lot of fine-tuning proponents weren't focusing enough on what happens when you vary multiple things at once. There's something on the SCP on this where I think Luke Barnes in 2012 responded that like Max Tegmark or someone had done some work on this, and someone else, I can't remember. And then there's other physicists who in like 2019 are objecting, saying, look, the vast majority of worlds like this are, and I think it's just going to be a controversial point that without me reading all of these papers and the discourse, right, I'm not willing to have a strong opinion about, because I just don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question to pursue, but I just don't know, what I should believe about it, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's all I have. If there's any final things that you guys want to say, otherwise, assuming that you guys have the time, I'd like to jump into some questions from the audience.
Sure. No, yes. Questions.
I can do until 7 p.m. by the way, because I'm interviewing Neil Manson on fine tuning at 7 on my channel.
Oh, fun. Jesus, Nathan, you just like to abuse yourself sometimes, don't you? Right? So the first question we have is from Scott Duke. Some apologists make use of molecular machines and factories in biology to advocate for intelligent design. Are these considered teleological arguments? And we didn't really touch on biological teleology or fine-tuning. Well, I think this is I'm sorry, go ahead.
This is the classic example, isn't it, really, or at least it's close to a classical example of the teleological argument or the design argument, which was to look at biological life and see that it looks really complex. It looks like things are working like the insides of a clock, like clockwork. This was kind of the original form of it, and I think it was a perfectly interesting and good argument at the time, but we see that it isn't the case. There aren't molecular machines or systems within biological life which are irreducibly complex, as far as we know. And if they're not irreducibly complex, then evolution by natural selection can provide the explanation for why the various mechanisms within us work, and there's no need to apply to any kind of teleology.
Yeah, I broadly agree with that. There's a lot of different arguments of this type that are made. There's kind of the classical arguments from analogy that are going to be saying something like there are means fitted together for ends, right? And there are products of human activities that are means fitted together for ends. So if they're analogous in several respects to these kind of biological systems where there are means fitted together for ends, then probably they're analogous in this further sense, right? That they're created by a designer or something like that. And as Matt said, we kind of have counterexamples to those, and then there's this whole discourse about, well, is there irreducible complexity, like in the flagellum of a bacteria, whatever? Again, some of those things are just going to be questions for biologists to answer. But as far as I'm aware, biologists have responded to people like Michael Behe making these claims and shown that that his claims about irreducible complexity are just in fact false. And then more recently, I've seen claims about the kind of the genetics that code for molecular machines containing information, right? And then introducing some kind of causal principle, like this sort of information can only be specified by an intelligent agent or something. And I just think there's a lot of confusion about the way that information is talked about there, right? So whether what's meant by information is some kind of measure of entropy or some kind of measure of randomness, whether what's meant by information is semantic information, like people might informally talk about, you just told me that you went to the shops or something. That's like semantic information. And that's a very different sense to what might be meant. And there's, obviously if what's meant is semantic information, it's not like there's a protein reading, with like a conscious mind reading the DNA and going, right, that's guanine, so now I'm going to do that or something. Like that's just obviously false. And if what's meant is kind of like these more like probabilistic notions of information or entropy or whatever, well, then it's just no mystery that DNA contains those types of information, because I mean, everything in some sense is, you know, from like my poo to a car or whatever, I mean, also contain that type of information. So, yeah.
I think just to answer the question, I would say these are a type of teleological argument, but going with what Nathan and Matt have outlined, I think biologists largely have responded to these, and I think that a lot of the assumptions made when these arguments are ran just aren't very, very well founded. The next one is from Jonathan Becker. We actually have a few from him. And he says, thoughts on relativizing fine-tuning to a specific probability measure? The idea would be we should only talk about fine-tuning if we've specified a distribution already.
Yeah, so this is kind of what I was saying in kind of distinguishing between apparent fine-tuning and well, so the way I usually like to think about fine-tuning first was just to say that within the space of possibilities, a very small subset of all the possibilities are life emitting, and so that's a way of kind of talking about fine-tuning without committing to a probability distribution, and so then you can talk about fine-tuning in that kind of sense first. But then, then you can talk about you can then start talking about things like the probability that life the expectation value we should have of a life-emitting universe existing. If you then put a probability measure over this space, so you could. So there are discussions about what kind of distributions you put over this. Generally, it's assumed that the most sensible thing to do is just have a flat prior over this. Just say, because it makes sense at least to say that epistemically, there's no reason we know of really at the moment why the constant should take one value over any other. And so a flat prior seems fairly sensible. The other possibly sensible choice is to put an infinitely spiked prior just to our particular value of these constants and say that it's one and none of the others are epistemically possible. These are very extreme. These are both complete extremes, but they're probably the most sensible, unless you're kind of going for maybe a tiny little peak around ours and then flat everywhere else. So I think there are discussions about what probability measure to put over this thing. I don't think it makes a huge difference unless you want to start making claims about how probable life is. I think even without specifying a probability distribution, I think all the interesting things about fine-tuning come out in that why is this universe a life-emitting one when it seems that lots of other points on this possibility space aren't.
As far as my thinking about this goes, I agree with everything that Matt said, firstly. And in my personal evaluations, I do tend to take a kind of like flat prior approach, right? And I when it comes to just thinking, well, there's n number of ways that these different values could have been, so I'm just going to apply something like a principle of indifference, right? To what I should assign to any particular one of those being true. Now, I'm also willing to accept that could be a sort of product of my ignorance or something. So if someone comes along and gives me some good principled reasons not to think about the distribution that way, I'm open to not thinking about it in that way. But I just haven't really, it's sort of like, for all I know, there could be these reasons, right, against my doing that. But I mean, for all I know, there also aren't these reasons, and that's the best thing to do. So I'm just not going to do anything either way and continue to think about it the way that I am until those such reasons are actually kind of presented to me.
I really don't have anything to add on this one over and above what you guys have said. This next one is also from Jonathan. This is a question specifically for Matt. When we talk about configurations of constants being life prohibiting, is that a claim that we won't get life with high probability or with certainty?
I guess first we should say whether this is. I would only talk about physical life. That's the only kind of life I have any knowledge of or experience with. So,
are you sure you're not a soul?
Yeah, actually, fair enough.
Are you sure you're not a Boltzmann brain? That's the real question.
But yeah, so when we talk about them being life prohibiting, it's not necessarily. It's saying we have good reason essentially to think that this particular configuration, there's no physical life possible. You know, when we talk about these other configurations, when I talk about a life prohibiting configuration, I literally mean a universe which collapses in a fraction of a second, or expands so quickly that individual particles will never interact at all ever. You know, I leave it open to you to decide whether that's whether there's a probability of getting life in these situations. To me personally, I think that I would just call this, from my perspective, a life prohibiting scenario.
Anything you would like to add to it, Nathan?
No, I just agree with that. But I think what the question does get at, which is useful, is just how, you know, like how difficult it is really to talk about these different types of life, and how easy it is to sort of slip between, you know, like using a particular kind of definition of life, which is a very kind of naturalized one, right? And kind of as I'm trying to think about the best way of articulating either like grounded or supervening on something like physical states of affairs, or life in various sort of other senses, right? And I think that is important because, as I say, you know, if that's the evidence, well, then that's going to just be inconsistent with certain hypotheses.
I really liked your answer there, Matt. If I was understanding it correctly, it seemed that you were saying that when we talk about like a universe being life prohibiting, what we're really saying is that there really isn't any physically possible pathway through which at least physical life would be capable of evolving or developing. In such a reality, we would just call that life prohibiting. Life is just not there aren't physical pathways that we can get what we would recognize as life, at least in a physical sense. Is that
essentially? I don't want to. It's a position really of, I don't want to say I don't know what the criteria for life are, so I present this scenario. There's most universes look like this. For me, I'd call that life prohibiting. If you want to disagree, you can do, because there isn't a kind of clear classification, because we don't know what the criteria for life are. But I would say that is life prohibiting. And if you would agree that a scenario like that sounds life prohibiting, then we're in agreement.
And then this next question is for Nathan. Does fine-tuning even make sense on a classical account of probability, i.e. probability as a proportion of possible worlds? If God was free to create any world, seems like the LR, I honestly don't know what that means, is 1.
So by LR, he just means the likelihood ratio, the evidence.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So classical account of probability is a proportion of possible worlds. If God's free to create any world, it seems like the LR is 1. I'm just not sure why. If God's free to create any world and is omnipotent and has a reason to create this particular world, it seems like the LR is 1. But if God's just free to create any world, I mean, because I'm sort of unsure why God, you know, what God would choose, it seems like the LR isn't 1. So maybe I'm missing something in the question there, but because my answer seems a bit sort of short, but yeah.
Alrighty, this next one, I think, I'm curious as to what Nathan thinks about Dustin Crummett's argument from psychophysical harmony. Does he think it raises the likelihood of theism at all?
I need to read more into it, really, to form. I don't have a strong opinion. That's it. I mean, I could sort of lie and pretend, you know, I've got a strong opinion and something smart to say about it, but I just honestly don't, you know.
What about you, Matt? You have anything to say about this?
I have not heard about this.
I can't. Go
my
ahead.
Knowledge of psychophysical stuff is not very strong.
It's very recent, and some people have said, I mean, theist apologists have said, you know, this is a very strong argument. So I mean, I sort of take that with a pinch of salt, but and I'm aware of some of the bits of it, but I've not read the, you know, what he's actually written there. So I need to do that and then form my opinion.
I've heard of Dustin Crummett, but I can't say I've heard of this argument. But as Nathan said, if it's a fairly new argument, that would probably explain why. The next one is from Oscar. Isn't epistemic probability so incredibly permissive that this problem just will never go away? I can always imagine more dead universes than alive ones.
Read more, Oscar. The joke being that, like, you know, the idea is that, you know, as you learn more and more information, that epistemic what's epistemically probable becomes, less and less permissive. But yeah.
I think it's what's important about distinguishing between epistemic and metaphysical probability in this sense is when we were talking about, say, the space of the possible values of the constants. Now, when we're deciding over whether fine-tuning is pointing out something important or not, we need to assign a kind of epistemic probability on these possible values. Generally, what we do is a flat prior, because we think that by principle of indifference, we think that these are all epistemically, these are all equally possible. And so once we do that, we can then say that we can then start to think about fine-tuning as being something surprising, the existence of a life-missing universe being unlikely. Now, I think you need to do that because what we actually want to do is we then want to work out what the actual metaphysical probability distribution is. If you have a universe generating mechanism, then there will be an actual probability distribution over the different values of the constants. For example, it could be that R, in the set of life-emitting universes, it could be the case that R constants turn up with a 50% probability. So there could actually be an actual probability assigned to each possible value of the constants. And it's essentially what we're doing by working with this epistemic probability is to point out that based on what we currently know, the situation we find is surprising. And so what we then want to do is we then want to work out, well, what actually is the actual probability distribution? And we may then find out that it leads to our observations being much more likely than we would expect based on what we currently know.
All righty. I don't think I really have anything to say with respect to this comment. Our next one is from Mark Reed. This one probably would be best for Matt to answer since he's our physicist. I think we might have touched on this a bit already, but he said, I would like to hear what they think about the universe collapsing or not forming if the laws of physics are changed. Is it possible for a different universe to form other constants? I'm wondering if he's asking, is it possible for there to be a universe that had other constants, or are these the only constants that could obtain?
So first of all, from the point of view that these are just constants that we just have to put in from observation, epistemically, yeah, they could epistemically have been different. For all we know, they could have been different. Whether they could actually have been different metaphysically, or in this case maybe just physically, it depends on the universe. If there's a multiverse, how universes get produced and what the laws are that govern how the constants end up with their values. So, for example, it could be the case that from a high energy theory of everything, let's say, for example, string theory, you can get lots of kind of different constants appearing based on how, this is how it happens in string theory, based on how various of the other dimensions end up curling up. Okay. The extra dimensions that we don't see in string theory, how they curl up determines the physics that that universe would then see. So if we take string theory as a particular example, then yes, it's perfectly possible for there to be different universes or different space-times with different constants, or even different looking what are called effective laws, low energy laws, because in different regions of space-time, these or in different universes, these extra dimensions will be compactified, crushed down into different shapes, different configurations. So it depends on whatever comes next in science. It could be the case that these constants had to be the particular value that they are, or it could be the case that there's a particular mechanism which determines how universes end up with various constants, with various laws. And so, yeah, it would be perfectly possible for different universes to form with different effective laws, different effective constants.
Alrighty, this next one is from Mitesh Patel. I'm not actually sure how to pronounce that. I just highlighted it because I think it brings up somewhat of an interesting point, and I was interested in your guys' perspectives. In brewing, some byproducts, say methanol, is unwanted but still gets produced in tiny quantities. Does that mean brewing is a process fine-tuned to create methanol?
I tend to I sort of think that this is right in the sense that fine tuning is meant right, and I think what it gets into is the kind of ambiguity in the use of the term fine tuning, because I think in the because of the metaphor, and maybe Matt's going to disagree with everything you're saying, that'd be all right as well, but in the sense of the metaphor, right, it almost makes it seem, when you say fine tuned, it makes you think in terms of expecting that thing. But the actual sense in which fine tuning is being used is that this thing is very improbable, but it's there anyway, sort of thing. And so yeah, I think I think that maybe this saying, yeah, technically, the brewing process is fine tuned for methanol is true, and the fact that that's misleading might be a kind of case for linguistic reform or something, to choose a better word. But I don't know, maybe you would disagree that that is totally analogous.
I think I disagree, because I think what we mean in fine tuning is if we were to change something about the process, if we were to change the constants, we end up with something vastly different. So it could be the case that however you brew, you'll always end up with methanol, in which case I'd say that the brewing process isn't fine tuned, because you could have done it even though you're always ending up with a small quantity. However you brew it, you always end up
that's a good point.
With methanol. So I don't know enough about brewing. Maybe there are ways that you can end up with very little or none, and these vastly outnumber the ways that you end up with it. But I guess it's probably actually that methanol always turns up, and so actually brewing is not fine tuned to create methanol.
Yeah. So it's the question is quantifying over all the ways of brewing, how many of them contain methanol, and if the proportion is small, then it's fine. So yeah, I retract what I previously said, but let's.
The next one is again from Jonathan Becker. Thoughts on OSCs, I don't think I know what that is, and exotic life forms. Idea, if exotic forms of life are possible, it's a mystery that we are embodied.
So OSCs are observer selection effects, which are what we were talking about before. And it depends what's meant by exotic forms of life here, because I typically come across exotic forms of life being taken to refer to non-carbon-based physical life forms still, rather than sort of ensouled or panpsychist or different psychophysical laws life forms. So in that sense, if exotic means physical, then it's sort of a requirement that you're in some sense embodied, right? Whereas if exotic means different kind of like disembodied minds or panpsychists, then it sort of might be a question as to why we're embodied at all. Yeah, I think it could be an interesting question, just depending on which question is being asked. If it's the question, so if we're quantifying over all of the possibility space includes disembodied mind worlds. Yeah, I don't know why we are physically embodied rather than just ensouled in that case.
Yeah, I totally agree there.
I mean, maybe my answer would actually be something like, because I think it's metaphysically necessary, right, that minds supervene on brains or something. So we have, and that's the direction I go in. But
our last question is from Oscar, or at least the last one that I had starred. It's from Oscar. Seems to be no talk about the fine-tuning of the designer's psychology. For every set of fine-tuned parameters, I can imagine a designer that desires those parameters. I'm not myself quite certain if I understand what Oscar is.
I don't know if maybe this is what we were talking about when, for theism to actually explain, to resolve the fine-tuning observation, you need your designer, your explanation, God, to have certain properties, certain desires. And so I guess I don't know if maybe this is pointing out that God isn't really being a good explanation at all, in the sense that there's fine-tuning which we then defer to God, because then his desires end up needing to be selected just so that we end up with a God that wants to create life, wants to create this kind of life, wants to create life with free will and these kind of properties. And so actually maybe the claim here is that you're just pushing back fine tuning one further. And this is something that that would be something that I kind of agree with, in that I think God is almost, in some senses, an ad hoc explanation for the fine tuning that we see. It's, it doesn't seem to me to be a very good explanation to say that there's this object that exists with exactly the right desires to produce what we end up seeing. Okay, where do those desires come from? Are they necessary? What's their nature? That to me seems a problem.
I
like
do
that
think
answer.
this is. Oh, sorry.
I like that answer.
I think that this is an interesting question. Probably along the same lines, right? That in order to be the advocate of fine tuning, maybe in order to be consistent, is going to have to apply the same reasoning all over again to their proposed theistic explanation. So as Matt said, the kind of ad hocness built into the God hypothesis is going to be that, well, for every constant, right, God has a causal power such that he can, set it to that value, and a desire such that he sets it to that value. And you might say, well, of all the ways that God could have been, that's a very, why is God kind of fine-tuned to be this type of God rather than any other God? And then you might say, well, look, that has a really high likelihood, of, and then invent some huge number or something. That has a very high likelihood given a god or something like that, right? Whereas it's very unexpected given some chance hypothesis, whatever. So maybe you could do this, but again, you'd have to flesh it out, and I think it would fall foul of all of the kind of methodological questions and things that there are in the fine-tuning argument in the first place, because the proposed explanation then is going to be ad hoc and stuff. But it might be a good objection, because then in order to kind of stop you from making that move, right, maybe the fine-tuning advocate is going to have to respond to that fine-tuning, the meta fine-tuning argument, in a way that's going to undermine their original fine-tuning argument, giving reasons, that to undermine the kind of likelihoods and things.
And that is all I have for questions. So I did, unless there's anything else you guys want to add, I thought this was an absolutely phenomenal discussion. I learned actually a lot. And I wanted to have this discussion, particularly with you two, because the more I started reading and thinking about fine-tuning arguments, the more I realized I don't think I really understand it that well. And I've heard both of you comment and talk frequently about these things, and I knew that you guys had a good grasp of this. We'll start with you, Nathan, this time. Is there anything you got coming up on your channel, anything you'd like to plug?
Well, in literally 30 minutes, I'm talking to Neil Manson about fine-tuning. So he's a philosopher who's skeptical of fine-tuning and has published quite extensively on these arguments. Other than that, I mean, in a month's time, I have an interview with Dale Allison planned. So my channel's Digital Gnosis. And for people who are interested in the interviews, they're all uploaded in podcast form as well under Digital Gnosis. And I have, other open hangouts and me getting angry at apologists and things like that on my YouTube channel as well.
Matt, got anything that you got planned? Anything you want to plug?
I've been very unproductive lately. Generally I've been turning up on other people's channels is all I've been able to manage so far for the last couple of months. But no, it was lovely to be on here, and I definitely want to continue making content. I love these discussions, and I love there's so much interesting stuff going on in these areas. So I will definitely be producing more content. I'm not quite sure exactly what it is yet.
Right on. Well, guys, thanks for tuning into this first installment of Critically Examined. And I am, for the ending here, going to make myself big here,
Thanks, Leo, just while I'm still got my voice.
Thank you guys very much for showing up. You can stick around or you can take off. I'm going to end the stream when I'm done here. But for my audience, come on, guys. You already know what I'm going to ask you to do. You already know what I'm going to say. There's a little red button down there. I want you to go ahead and press that. A little bell icon next to it. That's probably something you should press. I want you to like the video fast, share it with people that you think might be interested, and comment down below some ideas for this new program, Critically Examined. Are there any kind of arguments particularly you'd like to see critically examined? This is a program that I'm going to be doing with me and other people that I bring on that I think are probably more versed in the arguments, where we just talk about them and, objections, defenses, good ones, bad ones. So you give me ideas. Let me know what you want to hear. I want ideas from everybody, especially the atheists, but even the theists.